Chapters 40 and 41 of Lost, a Pearle, by Georgie Sheldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 40. The Doctor's Story. Before I begin my story, the young doctor began, allow me to introduce myself to you. My name is George Murdoch. I am a physician, and my residence is in London, where I have been practicing for the last 5 years. How I happen to be here just at this time, you will soon learn. I suppose, according to the laws of our country, I have been guilty of a very wrong thing. And yet, in doing what I have done, I was actuated only by the most humane feelings. It has been my practice during my residence in London to visit the morgue whenever I heard of an unusual accident, hoping to increase my stock of information thereby and benefit other sufferers. Hearing of the railway casualty which occurred more than a year ago, and to which you have referred, I visited the morgue early the following morning, and found the body of the girl who had been the only victim. I cannot describe to you my feelings as I looked upon the lovely unfortunate. A strange thrill went tingling through all my nerves, and a feeling of bitter rebellion arose in my heart against the sad fate that had slain her, and sent her to that place to be gazed upon by the idle and curious. It was early, as I said. I was the first one who had come there that morning, for which I have always been thankful, for I fear I should never have had the nerve to do what I did in the presence of a prying throng. I went alone into the room where she lay, so white and still, and so delicately beautiful, and stood gazing upon her, wondering who she could be, and if the news of her untimely end would reach her friends and they come to claim her, before she should begin to grow hideous and repulsive. She lay as if asleep. Her abundant hair had become loosened, and rippled over her shoulders and bosom in great luxuriant waves, and was as smooth and glossy as satin. Her face was rounded and full, and very, very fair to look upon, excepting a bruise far up on one side of the forehead. Her lips were slightly parted, showing the even rows of white teeth between, and one hand rested upon her breast. The other lay by her side, and I noticed upon the third finger of this a broad band of gold. She has been married, I said to myself, and then I observed that she was clad in black. Her dress and mantle and her bonnet and veil which lay beside her were all black. A young widow, perhaps, I thought, though there was no crape to indicate deep mourning. And then the feeling impressed me that perhaps she had no friends, perhaps she was alone in the world. She might even be one of those unfortunate ones who, discouraged with life and rendered desperate by its troubles, had sought her own death. I involuntarily took in mine one of the soft white hands, which seemed like wax outlined against the deep black of her dress. And it was a beautifully shaped hand. To my surprise, it was not rigid, as I had expected to find it, but soft and pliable almost as my own. And as I looked, a thrill like the piercing of a knife shot through me. One of the slender fingers twitched. "It is but the result of my imagination," I said, chiding myself for becoming so unduly excited. But even as I said it, my own fingers sought her pulse. My heart bounded into my throat, and a terrible trembling seized me as I felt it feebly vibrate beneath my touch. "She is not dead," I whispered, feeling my own face blanch, and a cold perspiration starting out all over me. No, she was not dead, for still holding that wrist I could feel the faint pulsations that had startled me so. But I knew she would die unless she had immediate and vigorous treatment. My first impulse was to notify the authorities and have her taken to the hospital. But the hospital was a long distance from the morgue. The officials would have no interest in the case, and there might be a long delay that would be fatal to the faint promise of life in that almost lifeless form. No one had come to claim the body. Indeed, her friends might be living a long distance from London, if she had any. If I left her there and said nothing, I should go away feeling guilty of murder. Whatever I did I must do quickly, and it was then, on the impulse of the moment, that I resolved to do a bold thing. I never once stopped to consider what the consequences would be if my act was discovered. I only thought of bringing back life to that beautiful unknown girl, whose face had impressed me as no other had ever done. I went out to the authorities and claimed her as mine, my sister, and I think they never once doubted my word, for my white face and trembling tones had all the appearance of grief and horror over a fate so terrible to a relative. I have often been troubled since, when thinking of the distress of the real friends should any come to claim her, but I have never for one moment regretted the step I took. I had her conveyed at once to my own humble home, where, after relating my story to my mother, she joined me heart and hand in my efforts to resuscitate the apparently lifeless girl. We were rewarded after long and arduous labor. Suspended animation was restored. The girl breathed, moved, and swallowed the restoratives we gave her, but showed no signs of consciousness. A tedious brain fever followed this, and many times we despaired of her life. But my mother is an excellent nurse, and to her our patient owes her life. It was a tough struggle, however, between life and death. But she had evidently been in perfect health at the time of the accident, and she had also a strong and vigorous constitution, so that she at last rallied and began to recover physically. But to my dismay, I found that her reason was wrecked. She was an idiot. I could not account for it at first. The bruise upon her head had not been severe enough to cause either death or idiocy. There were no other injuries that were very severe, and her sickness could not have produced any such fatal results. In only one way, I reasoned, could it have been caused, and that must have been the shock and fright she experienced on perceiving, as she supposed, that she must be killed. She has been very sweet and attractive in her imbecility. There has been nothing repulsive about her condition. She has never been strong since her sickness, and demands constant care and attention. But she has been so sweetly patient, gentle, and lovable, that my mother and I have grown to love her most tenderly. I have had a theory of my own all through her illness, although I have never given expression to it until today. I have read of instances where imbecility was caused by some shock or fright, and the recovery was produced in a like manner. A great shock had deprived our charge, may we have called her, of her reason, and I have felt that it was barely possible that something of this kind might restore it again. Today an event occurred which has led me to hope that such is indeed the case. "Is it possible?" interrupted Pearle with almost breathless interest. "Oh, I hope so. Can it be possible that she is Amy's mother?" "Wait until I tell you the rest of my story, Miss Melford, before you allow yourself to hope too much," the young doctor said, with a kindly smile into her excited face. "I took my fair charge out this afternoon, and we went to a little arbor at the end of the south walk. She had been nervous all day. She has nervous attacks occasionally which leave her quite weak, and it is often very difficult to quiet her. Sometimes by singing to her we can soothe her very quickly, and so I have grown into the habit of singing to her frequently. Today I was only half through my song when I was startled by something white darting past me with a cry that made every nerve in me tingle, and the next moment I saw a little golden-haired child spring into the lap of my patient and fall sobbing and crying upon her bosom. May uttered a piercing shriek and fainted dead away. But the little one, seeming to be nearly wild, continued kissing her lips, patting her pale cheeks, and calling, "Mamma, mamma!" "Amy," murmured Pearle, feeling faint herself, as she began to realize toward what all this tended. "Yes, it was the little girl whom I have often seen with you, but I could not stop to inquire into the cause of her grief and strange actions then. I gave her into the care of the maid, who just then came for her, and brought May directly back to the hotel. She had received a fearful shock, for she kept relapsing into fainting fits for more than an hour, and I was beginning to fear for the result, when she revived, and I was instantly startled by remarking a strange look in her eyes. It was not the look of confidence and trust that she usually regarded me with, but a curious puzzled expression, as though she did not know me, and almost immediately she began glancing anxiously about the room and asked for her baby, her Amy, her precious pet. I was almost as much agitated at this as I was when in the morgue I first saw her finger twitch and knew that she was not dead. I realized that my theory was correct. This shock, I believe, has restored the reason which I had feared must be forever clouded. At first I hardly knew what to do. I could not believe that this child was really hers. I thought it might be a singular coincidence of resemblance, and I almost feared to send for her again, at her request, lest a disappointment should produce a relapse into her former state. I expressed no surprise at her questions regarding the little one, and when I thought her strong enough to bear it, I sent for her. I was not left in doubt long, for the moment the door opened, little Amy bounded to the bedside, and the mother and child again recognized each other. "I cannot tell you how this strange occurrence has affected me," Dr. Murdoch continued with emotion. "I am deeply grateful for this change in my patient, grateful, too, that she will be restored to the friends who love her, and that the mystery which has so long enveloped her will now be cleared away. And yet she has grown so dear to my mother and to me, that it will be very hard for us to part with her." There was a huskiness in George Murdoch's voice as he concluded, and a mist, like unshed tears, in his eyes. "Heaven be thanked!" Pearle ejaculated. "My darling is no longer motherless." And she almost sobbed with joy that the terrible mystery which had so long shrouded beautiful Alice Renault was at last solved. But how strangely solved! "Yes," returned the doctor, "it is certainly a matter to be deeply grateful for. As soon as I deemed it safe to leave my charge, I came to seek you, hoping that you would be able to throw some light on the subject. Do you know anything of her past history beyond what you have already told me?" he asked with considerable anxiety. "No, nothing of any moment," Pearle answered, and then she told him how she happened to go to Madame Renault, of her sojourn there, of the old lady's death, and her subsequent adoption of little Amy. "You have done a noble deed, Miss Melford, in caring for this motherless child," Dr. Murdoch said with a glance of admiration when she concluded. Then, the look of anxiety returning to his face, he asked, "Did you say that Amy's mother, was a widow?" "No, I learned nothing of her private history. But from the fact of Madame's telling me that the little one was called Amy Renault, I judged that her mother must have been a son's wife, although Madame never spoke of a son, and the servants knew nothing about it. There seemed to be something rather mysterious about the family," Pearle replied. The doctor looked grave, but after a thoughtful silence he said with a sort of regretful smile, "I am afraid you and I will have cause to regret much, as well as to be thankful for much, when we are called to part with our charges." "Yes, indeed," Pearle replied, the tears starting quickly to her eyes again. "I have grown to love Amy as well as if she really belonged to me. In fact, I had come to regard her as mine, as I had despaired of ever finding anyone to whom she belonged." "She is a charming little fairy. I had supposed until a day or two ago that she belonged to the family with whom you are engaged," said the doctor. Pearle's face fell at these words, for they at once brought back to her mind her own precarious situation, which in listening to the physician's tale she had entirely forgotten for the time. George Murdoch noticed her troubled manner, and at once connected it in his mind with her interview with the man whom he had seen in the reception parlor, but of course he did not wish to appear curious, and so waited for her to break the silence. He knew she wanted to speak of it from the anxious glance she cast at him every now and then. "Would you like to come in and see my fair charge?" he asked, at last, to break the awkward pause. Pearle started, and at once became violently agitated. "Yes," she said, but, Dr. Murdoch, I find myself in a very trying position just at this time. My interview with you has inspired me with confidence in you, and though I know you have care enough on your mind just now, I feel impelled to trespass still further upon your kindness, and throw myself upon your protection, until I can communicate with my friends." He gave her a frank look of sympathy as he replied, "Anything that I can do to serve you, Miss Melford, you may be assured I shall be most happy to do." "Thank you. You are very kind, and I must tell you the truth, for you will doubtless learn it in some other way if I do not. It seems a strange thing that a woman should be obliged to seek protection against her own husband, but such is the fact. The man whom you saw in the parlor with me, I am compelled to acknowledge, stands in that relation to me," Pearle explained with drooping eyes and crimson cheeks. She did not think it right to allow him to remain in ignorance of this fact, though it was terribly humiliating to her to confess it. "Ah," he said with a start of surprise. He had not once thought that she could be a wife. "Yes, and I have been trying to hide from him for a long time." Then, thinking he might wonder why she did not claim the protection of Lady Fennelsey, she continued, "He has followed me here, and has had an interview with Lady Fennelsey, who, upon discovering the fact of which I have just spoken, considers that I am no longer fit for the position which I have hitherto occupied, and she has accordingly dismissed me. I was feeling very miserable and forlorn indeed when you sought me so opportunely." She then proceeded briefly to give him some account of her trouble, and the exceedingly uncomfortable position in which she now found herself. "You need protection, surely," he said when she concluded, "and you shall have it until you can communicate with your friends, which, pardon me for the suggestion, I should advise you to do at once. You are not fitted to combat single-handed with such villains as the one whom you have described." "Thank you. The world seems very large, but it really is exceedingly small when one wants to hide oneself. If I am to lose Amy, I shall need comfort, and I believe I shall go back to my brother's care, at least for the present," the lonely girl said, with quivering lips and tear-laden eyes. The young doctor felt for her deeply. She was so beautiful, and he had never dreamed of her having so tragic a history. "Shall I demand an interview with that man, and acquaint him with the fact that I have taken you under the shadow of my wing, and warn him of the consequences if he attempts to molest you?" he asked, trying to speak lightly. "I do not believe that will be necessary," she answered. "I only wish to feel that I may appeal to you in case he should seek to compel me to accompany him from this place." "Very well. Then consider yourself one of my family until your friends come for you. And now, will you come and see Amy's mother?" Pearle assented, and he led the way into another room, where they met Mrs. Murdoch, whose motherly face had attracted Pearle from the first. The doctor introduced them, and asked after his charge. "She is very comfortable," was the reply, "but in a state of curiosity regarding both herself and the little one, who she declares has grown half since she saw her. And," his mother added, smiling, "she does not know what to make of either you or me." "We will soon explain all to her," her son returned, and drawing Pearle's arm within his, he drew her in a chamber beyond, where the fair invalid lay, very pale and wan, but looking nevertheless a perfect picture of happiness and beauty, as she hugged to her bosom her newly recovered treasure, and looked down with the light of reason and recognition once more in her beautiful brown eyes, into the deep blue orbs of this her child, who, with her little arms twined lovingly around her neck, would not consent to be taken from her mother. 41. Dr. Murdoch's Love for Alice. As the door opened and Pearle entered the room with the doctor, Amy cried out joyously, her cheeks flushed with excitement, her eyes dancing with happiness. "Auntie, auntie, mamma, my own pretty mamma has come back." Pearle with difficulty restrained her tears at the words, for they told her but too surely that ere long she and her bright little comforter must part company. But she withdrew her arm from that of her escort, and going directly to the bedside, she knelt down so that she could look into those deep brown eyes which were now fixed so earnestly and questioningly upon her. "Are you Alice Renaud?" she asked gently, but an intense earnestness quivered in her tones. "Yes, that is my name," the fair stranger answered, but she looked greatly surprised at the question, and put her hand to her head in a puzzled way, as if trying to recall something, while a vivid crimson stained her cheek as she met the eager look bent upon her. "And are you sure that Amy, this little one, is your child?" Pearle continued. "Yes, my very, very own," returned the young mother in trembling tones, as she clasped the little form closer to her. Then, becoming excited by the vivid memories that seemed to come crowding upon her, she cried, with blanching cheeks, and a look of horror leaping to her eyes, "Oh, that dreadful engine! Those shrill, piercing whistles! Those thundering noises! That terrible shock and fright that held me spellbound to meet my death! I could not move. I could not speak nor cry out. I could only stand and look and wait while that shrieking monster came nearer and nearer, until it sent me down,
down into the blackness of darkness. Ah, it was dreadful, it was maddening, but I could not move, I was frozen, paralyzed. My baby, who will care for my darling, was the one thought that burst my heart and seared my brain when, as I believed, I was dropping into eternity." Her voice died away into a hoarse whisper, while, exhausted with excitement and the fearful remembrance, she lay sobbing and wringing her hands wildly, and then clasping Amy to her convulsively, again kissing her shining head and murmuring fond wild words over her. George Murdoch regarded her with an anxious look on his face. He went to her with an air of resolution, and unclasping her clinging arms, put Amy into Pearl's lap, she having seated herself in a chair by the bed when she saw the invalid becoming so excited. "Alice," he said in gentle yet authoritative tones, and using her name for the first time, "you must be quiet. You must not think of what has passed, for it excites you so. You must be calm, or I shall be obliged to send Amy and everyone else from the room." His manner seemed to reassure her, and she grew quieter almost immediately, though deep sobs still shook her slight frame. Dr. Murdoch mixed something in a spoon and held it to her lips. She took it obediently, and then looking up into his manly face with a puzzled expression, she asked simply, "Who are you? I have never seen you before, and yet it seems as if I have dreamed of you very often." A look of pain shot into his eyes at this. He had watched and tended her so long. He had studied night and day that he might know how to treat her case. He had devoted every spare moment to her, and she had clung to him with almost childish dependence during the months of her mental weakness. And now, when what he had always desired was accomplished, she did not even recognize him. He knew that he had no right to expect anything different, that the May, whom his voice alone could soothe in her nervous hours, and the Alice of the present moment were entirely different beings. And yet the knowledge brought with it a pang that he had never looked for. "I am your physician," he said in reply to her question, "and I cannot allow you to talk any more, unless you are very quiet. This lady beside you is Miss Melford, and she has had the care of Amy during your illness, for you have been sick for a long time." "Is that why my head feels so strangely? Why I cannot think of all I wish?" she asked, putting both her trembling hands to her temples. "Yes, and you will not be able to think at all unless you heed what I say. I thought you would like to be assured that Amy had been well cared for, and if you will promise not to become excited again, I will allow Miss Melford to talk to you a while," the young doctor said, watching her closely all the time he was speaking. "What is your name? Were you called when I was hurt? Dr. Ashley was my mother's physician." She stopped suddenly, while a look of remembrance and anxiety settled over her face. She was about to go on, but Dr. Murdoch, seeing the look, interrupted. "My name is George Murdoch. I found you after you were hurt, and that is how you happened to be under my care." But he could not check the tide of memories that came rushing back to her, now that the natural vigor of her brain was beginning to be restored. "My mother! Where is my mother?" she cried, starting up and resting upon her elbow, and without appearing to heed what he had said, as she recalled another of the cares that had been hers before the great darkness came upon her. Pearle grew pale, and cast an appealing glance at the young physician. He answered it with a warning look, and then quietly replied, "It is well with Madam your mother, and everything that has occurred during your illness shall be explained to you, if you will have a little patience." "I will be patient," she answered submissively. Then holding out her arms again, she added with a hysterical sob that was half a laugh, "But give me back my pet. Amy, come to mamma, and let me hold you close, or I cannot believe that I am not dead. Dead! Oh, it was so horrible." She began weeping nervously again, and the physician looked exceedingly anxious. "She must not talk any more to-day," he said decidedly, and he motioned to his mother and Pearle to leave the room. He then laid Amy upon the bed beside her mother, bidding her be very quiet, and after a half-hour of utter silence, during which he sat by the bedside, making gentle passes over the brow of his patient, he had the satisfaction of seeing both mother and child fall into a peaceful slumber.
Meantime, Pearle related all that she knew of their history to Mrs. Murdoch, and afterwards something of her own sad story, and the persecution and trouble that had that day overtaken her. And the matron's kind heart went out to the fair girl in tenderest sympathy. "You shall be one of us, dear," she said, kissing her flushed and tearful cheek. "That bad man shall not annoy you. We will protect you until your own friends come to care for you." Pearle felt greatly comforted by this promise of care, and made up her mind to write at once for her brother to come for her. The thought of giving up Amy, who had been such a comfort to her, nearly broke her heart, and the idea of going into another family as governess to receive the slights and insults which she had experienced during her residence with Lady Fennelsey, with no one to love or cheer her, was so repulsive to her that she decided she could not bear it. So long a time had elapsed since the day that had ruined her life, that she felt assured that the scandal consequent upon it must have died away before this. And she resolved that she would go back now to Ashton Manor, where she could live as secluded as she chose. "I will go home," she said to herself while considering the matter, "and devote myself to my brother's children. I can do much toward making them happy. I can direct their education and help form their characters. And besides, there are many poor people in whom I can interest myself, and thus fill my life with usefulness. I will petition for a decree of separation. I will be free from all further annoyance from that tyrant, and under Allstone's protection I may perhaps be able to learn something of content." After leaving Madame Murdoch she had an interview with the clerk of the hotel, with the intention of changing her room, as Lady Fennelsey had directed, and taking one near Dr. Murdoch's suite. But there was none to be obtained just then, and she was therefore obliged to remain where she was for the present. She was inexpressibly sad and lonely upon retiring that night. Amy was still with her mother, who would not allow her to go from her sight, and Pearle missed the little form that had heretofore nestled so contentedly in her arms, and been so much company for her. The next day Alice Renault appeared much better and stronger. She was much more composed, and her mind worked more quietly and rationally. When Pearle was admitted to her she received her very affectionately, drawing her down to her and kissing her gratefully. "I have been asking Amy a great many questions this morning, Miss Melford, and I know how kind you must have been to her to have gained her love so completely. She tells me, too," she went on, the tears rolling quietly over her cheeks, "that my mother is gone. I begin to realize that a long time has elapsed since my accident, but the most that I can think of just now is your tender care for my child." "It has been a very sweet care, a great comfort, too, to me," Pearle answered, drawing Amy into her arms and kissing her tenderly. "Indeed," she added, tears springing to her own eyes, "I find it very hard to be reconciled to the thought of giving her up, even to her own mother." "Will you begin at the very beginning, and tell me all?" Alice asked gravely, and trying not to betray how very anxious she was to learn all about the past, which had been so dark to her. Pearle complied, beginning with what she had learned of her own disappearance before she went to live with Madame Renault. She passed over as lightly as she could all the difficulties which had beset her path while she had the care of that forlorn household, giving as good an account as she truthfully could of Madame's sickness and death, mentioning gratefully Dr. Ashley's kindness and assistance, and speaking last of her own affection for Amy, her aversion of giving her up to the care of strangers, and her final resolve to adopt her. "I shall love you as long as I live," the young mother said, reaching out her hands and drawing Pearle to her again, her face quivering with gratitude. "Your patience, your charity, your tenderness have been almost divine, and in my thankfulness I could almost serve as your bondwoman all my life. To think that you should have had all that care of my mother, and that after that you should have actually toiled for my child's daily bread." "Do not speak of it, please," Pearle interrupted. "I must speak of it. Do you think that I, her mother, would let it pass, and not tell you how I love and honor you for it?" she asked with brimming eyes and quivering lips. "But," she added with a little smile into Amy's wonderful face, "my pet here is really quite an heiress, in spite of her apparently destitute condition, and she shall make it all up to her kind friend fourfold.
Miss Melford," she went on, her face brightening with a sudden thought, "you have said that you cannot bear to give Amy up, and since you have had to work for her and yourself, you surely cannot have much to bind you elsewhere. Won't you come and live with us? We shall be all alone now, in some quiet place that we shall choose when I am a little stronger."
Pearle smiled slightly to think that she should be regarded as destitute. She was nevertheless deeply touched by this kind thought for her, and answered with thanks that she would have duties that would now call her another way. But she would always feel that a common bond united them, and she would gladly spend a portion of every year with them if she desired.
"I do desire it," Alice Renault said eagerly, "and I shall always cling to you as a dear friend. I am very much alone in the world. Only Amy and I are left of all my family, and aside from the pleasure I shall take in rearing my little daughter, the future holds but very little to tempt me."
Ah, her husband is dead then. She was once a wife, thought Pearle, glancing sorrowfully at the delicate woman who seemed to be so friendless. "But," Alice resumed, heaving a deep sigh, as if she was crushing some burden back into her heart, "I suppose I must talk business with you a little. It is necessary for me to understand where to begin life again. You say that Dr. Ashley allowed you to store my household goods over his table?" "Yes, he was very kind in many ways. He said he would care for them, and very generously refused to accept any remuneration for any of his services." Alice colored at this. "He shall not go unrewarded, however," she said a little proudly; then asked somewhat anxiously, "Miss Melford, did you, among other things, notice a little foreign-looking chest or trunk?" "Yes, I noticed it particularly, on account of its peculiar appearance." "Did you notice its contents?" "I merely opened it, the key was in the lock, to see that it was in proper order to put away. I took possession of the key as I did of all of them, and have them in my trunk at this moment. And," she added with a smile, "I am very, very happy to have found their owner." "You found in that chest packages of letters, old account books, and bundles of papers?" Alice asked, not seeming to heed her last remark. "Yes, I noticed that it contained old books and papers. I did not examine them. I did not like to do anything," she said with heightened color, "which savored of curiosity. The position in which I found myself was, to say the least, peculiar, and I felt that I, a stranger, had no right to pry into family matters which, perhaps, it were better for both Amy and myself that I should know nothing about." "You were very considerate, Miss Melford," Alice said with a grateful glance, then added sadly, "You would have learned something of my history had you done so, and it could have done no real harm. Still, there are some things in our lives which we would prefer to keep locked within our own hearts. But what I was thinking of particularly was this. That chest belonged to an uncle of mine who came from Australia a few years ago. It has a false bottom which contains documents of great value to me, for they represent quite a handsome fortune which is invested in different ways. It is doubtful if you would have discovered this, even if you had examined the contents, but if you had only known of it there would have been no need of your toiling for bread for either yourself or my child. But I am glad to know the box is safe," she concluded with a sigh of satisfaction. "I knew, of course," Pearle returned, "that there must be ample means somewhere. Your style of living proved that. But Madam your mother was too ill to give me any information regarding such matters. The servants knew nothing, and so there remained only two things for me to do when all was over. Either to send Amy to some charitable institution, or take charge of her myself. The first I could not do. The second I was glad to do." "Ah! If you had sent her away to such a place, I should never have seen my child again," the young mother exclaimed, drawing Amy to her with a passionate gesture. "Mon Dieu!" she added with a sob, "what a life mine has been!" Pearle looked at her, a great pity shining in her eyes. She saw that some mystery shrouded her life, but of what nature she could not even guess. She was drawn to her more and more. She was gentle, refined, and well educated. She must have been very beautiful when in the bloom of health, for she was lovely now, though pale and wan from illness, and there was an unmistakable air of gentle breeding and good blood about her. She had not referred in the remotest manner to her husband, and once when Mrs. Murdoch, while caressing Amy, asked if she resembled her father, her lips grew white and stern, her gentle eyes almost fierce in their expression, as she answered briefly, "No," and then instantly changed the subject. They saw that it was very painful to her, and they never referred to it again. Dr. Murdoch, although still delicately attentive to her every want and need, had changed very perceptibly in his manner toward her since the restoration of her reason. Before, he had been tender and affectionate, treating her more like a beloved and petted child or younger sister than anything else. Now, when in her presence, he assumed a deference and courtesy such as he would have bestowed upon any patient who was a stranger to him, while his fine face had suddenly grown grave and thoughtful, and almost gloomy in expression. His mother noticed all this and wondered at it. Her own manner remained unchanged. Indeed, she seemed to love their beautiful charge, and to watch over her even more tenderly than before. "I suppose we shall not be able to keep Alice, I hardly know what to call her, with us much longer," she said, the same day that the above conversation with Pearle occurred. "I'm afraid not," he answered briefly, and turning his face from the light. Then, with a quickly drawn breath, he asked, "Has she spoken of any plans?" "No, but Miss Melford says she is wealthy, that she has quite a fortune." "Yes," he said with something of sharpness in his tone. "I am sorry, George. I have grown to love her very dearly, and I would be glad to have her with us always," Mrs. Murdoch continued with gentle plaintiveness. George Murdoch made no reply to this, but sat resting his head on his hand in gloomy silence. "Of course," his mother continued, "I do not mean that I am sorry that she has recovered the use of her mental faculties, but I wish she hadn't so much money. I shall be very lonely if she goes away from us. I wish we could persuade her to stay, and I should really love to have the little one chattering about." Still no answer from her companion. He sat like a statue, so ominously still, that she glanced at him with something of surprise, not unmixed with anxiety. But her mind was full of their charge, and she went on. "There is something rather strange about her past life, don't you think so, George? I wonder what kind of a husband she had, if he is dead or if not, what has become of him?" George Murdoch bounded from his chair with a suddenness that startled her. "Mother, I am going out. I have an errand in the city," he said in a strained, unnatural voice. He walked halfway across the room, stopped suddenly, then turning, came and stood behind his mother's chair. "Mother," he began, and, startled by his tone, she looked up at him and saw that he was deathly pale. She was on the point of remarking upon it, but something restrained her. "Mother," he repeated, "I think with you that there is some mystery connected with Alice's life, but on no account would it be best to seek to ascertain the nature of it." "Certainly not, my son. If she chooses to confide in us, well and good. If not, we will respect her silence, and care for her just as tenderly as we have always done, as long as she will stay with us. I know that she intends to make a home for herself somewhere. I heard her tell Miss Melford so, and when it comes to that, if it must, we will help her to find a pleasant one." His hand rested on the back of her chair, and she felt him tremble with the mighty effort that he made to speak calmly, while she saw the great drops of sweat shining on his forehead. "You will miss her as well as I," she said sadly. "Mother, don't!" he cried sharply and growing white about the mouth. "George!" Her eyes were opened at last, and she scanned his face with sorrowful surprise. Without a word he turned and walked abruptly from the room. Poor boy! I never dreamed that he would learn to care for her like that. She was like a little child in her helplessness, Mrs. Murdoch said, weeping over the discovery she had made. End of chapters 40 and 41. Chapters 42 and 43 of Lost, a Pearle, by Georgie Sheldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 42.
Fire! Help!"
Pearle remained with Alice and Amy until late in the evening of the day spoken of in the last chapter. Indeed, she had spent most of the time in their room since her interview with Addison Cheetham, for she stood in continual dread of meeting him again, as Dr. Murdoch told her he was still at the hotel, and haunted the halls and public rooms constantly. She had had an interview with Lady Fennelsey, and that worthy and high-minded dame had settled with her, when she had also undertaken to give her good advice. Miss Camilla took no pains to conceal the malicious joy she experienced upon learning that Pearle was to be dismissed, and kept throwing out spiteful hints and insinuations throughout the interview. Pearle paid not the slightest attention to the ill-mannered girl, which only served to irritate her 100-fold. But when Lady Fennelsey remarked in her condescendingly patronizing way that she trusted Mrs. Cheetham would now realize the necessity of redeeming her character, and yield the obedience that it was proper that a respectable wife should yield her husband, the outraged girl could contain herself no longer. "Lady Fennelsey," she said with proud dignity, "I would not forget for a moment that I am a lady, notwithstanding your slurs and innuendos, but I cannot refrain from telling you that your vulgar patronage is disgusting, and I believe you will yet live to realize and regret it." With which parting shot she bowed herself from her ladyship's august presence, leaving both mother and daughter speechless from astonishment for the first time in their lives. But to return to the time that Pearle bade her new friends good night, and retired to her own room. The next day she was to have an apartment adjoining theirs, as some of the guests were to leave then. So she spent an hour or two packing her trunks to save time on the morrow, for every moment that she could spare with Amy seemed too precious to be lost. Since discovering how she had been imposed upon, Lady Fennelsey had made a change in her domestic arrangements. It would not do to allow Fred and Clara, in their tender years, to remain longer under her disgraced governess's contaminating influence. Consequently, they had been removed to the room hitherto occupied by Miss Camilla and Franchita, while those young ladies, much to their disgust, were obliged to mount another flight of stairs to occupy their apartment, the door between which and Pearle's room was now kept securely locked. But all this was only adding one more link to the chain that was ere long to strangle forever their disgusting and ostentatious pride of birth and position. Pearle's task of packing completed, she retired, and soon fell into a quiet and peaceful sleep. No weight of care rested upon her now, her heart was freed from its chief burden, since she had determined to shake off, once for all, the galling shackles that bound her, while she felt safe and content in the protection of Dr. Murdoch until her brother could arrive. In another portion of that great building there was, on this night, a restless, impatient watcher. Addison Cheetham, with no desire to sleep, paced back and forth in his room, plotting and puzzling his brain over the knotty problem of how he was to accomplish what he had sworn he would do. Every now and then an oath would leap to his lips, that he should be so balked by a woman, and that, just when victory seemed so near, someone always interfered, or something occurred to frustrate his designs. He had not seen Pearle once since that afternoon when they were interrupted by Dr. Murdoch, though he had, as the young physician had told her, haunted all the halls and public rooms, determined to waylay her if he could get but a glimpse of her. And now he was trying to plan some way to outwit both her and her protectors, and if she would not go with him peaceably, he would lure her away by strategy. Hundreds of men, women, and children lay around him asleep. He alone of them, all refusing to yield to the influence of the drowsy god, and all alike unconscious of the fell demon so secretly at work around them, and creeping so stealthily inch by inch upon them, like some ambushed enemy bent upon their destruction. A clock somewhere near him struck 1. He took out his watch to see if his time agreed with it. It was 5 minutes of 1, and with a moody brow and a sigh of discontent, he began to think it was time for him to be in bed also. Suddenly a cry rent the air somewhere in the distance. It seemed far away and indistinct. He bent his head to listen, his cheeks blanching, his heart beating with great fierce throbs. Again he heard it. "Fire! Help!" It was a blood-curdling sound. There was another moment of utter silence, and then wild cries, shrieks, and groans rose upon the still night air, like the roar and tumult of a sudden storm. Addison Cheetham sprang to the door, unlocked and threw it open, and then bounded down the stairs 2 steps at a time. It had not been 2 minutes since that first indistinct cry reached his ears, but the whole building seemed to be alive with the humanity that so lately had been peaceably asleep. Crowds were rushing aimlessly hither and thither, shouting, shrieking, and begging for mercy and help. A perfect panic seemed to have seized the multitude, and they poured forth from that mammoth building as if they had been expelled by some mechanical agency within. "Where is the fire?" demanded Addison Cheetham of a porter. "In the north wing, 2nd floor," was the reply, as the man hurried on with his buckets toward the scene of the destruction. "Her room is in the north wing, 3rd floor," Addison Cheetham muttered with white lips. He knew well enough just where her room was, for he had not rested until he had ascertained that fact. He bounded on after the porter and found that the fire was working dire mischief in the 2nd story of the building. Brave men were valiantly rescuing helpless women and children from their danger, and everyone from the 2nd floor was safely conducted from the building and out of harm's way in 15 minutes from the time the first alarm was given. But the less unfortunate inhabitants of the 3rd floor seemed to be cut off from every avenue of escape. The fire had broken out near the middle of the corridor, just where the stairs led into the upper story, and the flames went creeping up through the framework. The smoke, dense and suffocating, ascended until it appeared as if there could be no help for those above. The confusion was appalling. The fire was being subdued in the 2nd story, but no one could ascend to the 3rd, and no one could escape from there through that line of flame and smoke upon the stairs. It was dreadful, and brave men felt their hearts quake with terror, their strength and courage forsake them, as they listened to the helpless appeals of those from above for them to come and save them. At last there was a joyful cry from without. A ladder had been raised from the roof of the low building or passage which connected the main structure with the north wing, and all the unfortunate captives in the rooms upon that side of the corridor were soon rescued from their danger. But those on the other side were still in imminent peril, for the corridor was now full of flame and smoke, against which every door had been shut and locked as soon as it had been ascertained that escape in that direction was impossible. Pearle's room was one of these, as was also that of the Mrs. Fennelsey. Addison Cheetham, on reaching the north wing, had rushed frantically up the 2nd floor, with the determination to run the fiery gantlet beyond at all hazards. "If I can save her life, she will owe it to me, and then I shall win. She cannot, she dare not defy me then," he cried as he dashed recklessly onward. But he was driven back. He could not breathe. No one could live a moment in that dense atmosphere. With a cry of despair he turned and rushed down the stairs again, as if his feet had been shod with wings. He sped out upon the veranda along the length of it, bounded over the railing, and eagerly scanned the panic-stricken faces looking forth from the windows of that fated upper story. He searched in vain, for not a familiar face did he see, and grew almost frantic with the sickening suspense. "Save my daughter! Save my children!" shrieked someone, clutching him frantically by the arm. He turned and looked to see who it was. It was Lady Fennelsey. A ray of hope shot through his heart. "Which room are they in?" he demanded. "That one. Oh, there. Be quick. The flames are beginning to burst through the roof. Oh, heavens! In a few moments it will be too late. Save them! Save them! And you shall have any price." And the distracted woman sank weeping and exhausted upon the ground. Men were now seen on the roof with long, stout ropes in their hands. These they let down to the windows, and the inmates of those rooms tied them around their waists and were lifted up in safety to the top of the burning building, and then carefully let down upon the other side by the ladder, where others received them and bore them away to safety. But this took time, and all the while the fire was spreading rapidly. All but 2 rooms had been emptied of their occupants, and here the roof was so hot that the men could not remain upon it a moment. These rooms were the ones occupied by Pearle and the Mrs. Fennelsey, and at one of the windows there could now be seen 3 white, terrified faces looking down upon the anxious crowd below. "They are lost. They must die," was whispered with horror from mouth to mouth. "Give me a ladder," cried a hoarse, stern voice from the crowd. "The ladders are all in use," someone answered. "A ladder, by heaven, I will have a ladder!" And a man darted frantically out of sight. In less than 3 minutes he was back, panting and excited, but with a long, strong ladder across his broad shoulders. Eager hands were ready to place it for him, while he wet a handkerchief and tied it over his mouth and nostrils. Then, with a command to the men to "hold it firm and steady," he sprang up the rounds with the agility of a cat. While he is ascending, we will see how it has fared with our gentle heroine. We have said that sleep, quiet and peaceful, came to her. Pleasant dreams also, dreams of home and friends, and of the bright beautiful days when she was so happy and carefree at Ashton Manor. Nothing of the confusion occasioned by the fire reached her until Miss Camilla and Franchita rushed, terror-stricken, into her room, calling wildly upon her to save them. They had been awakened by the cries and confusion below, had rushed into the corridor, thinking to escape thus, but were driven back by the flames and smoke, and were only too glad to seek refuge in their own room again. Then they had unfastened the door leading into Pearle's room to seek company in their misery. "What is the trouble?" she asked, much startled, while springing from her bed she began to put on her clothing. "We are all afire. The hall is in flames, and there is no way for us to escape," exclaimed Franchita, who was the calmer of the two sisters, Camilla having sunk down at Pearle's feet, clinging to her in abject terror and shrieking with fright. "Be quiet, Miss Fennelsey," Pearle said authoritatively. "We shall be saved, do not fear," though as she said it she grew sick at heart, as she heard the sharp crackling of the flames outside the door, and saw the puffs of smoke that came in through the keyhole and over the transom. Then she went to the window and looked out, but all that she could see was a sea of agonized faces and people running wildly about. A feeling of despair took possession of her. The room was growing hot and stifling. A few moments more, and she knew the flames would burst within. Even if help was sent to them, she began to think it very doubtful if they all could be saved. "One of us at least must perish, I fear," she thought as she counted the chances. She had been trembling and her teeth chattering with excitement. But now, as this terrible thought forced itself upon her, she grew suddenly calm and collected. For one moment she bowed her head in prayer. "God help us," she breathed. "Save these two who have home and happiness and friends to love them. And for thy servant, thy will be done." The next moment she turned her attention to the distracted girls clinging to her. She put them forcibly from her, darted into their room and brought their clothing, bidding them dress themselves, while she assisted them with nimble but steady fingers, never once making a false movement. Never in their lives had they been more helpless, but never before had they been more quickly clad. Pearle, on glancing from the window, now saw that a ladder had been placed underneath, and this gave her a faint hope. But just at that moment the transom cracked, the glass tumbled to the floor with a jingling crash, and the flames and smoke poured into the room in volumes. Camilla uttered a piercing shriek, and wound her arms about Pearle's form so that she could not move. "Oh, save me!" she moaned. "I cannot die. I am not fit to die." "Be still," Pearle said sternly as she wrenched her clinging hands apart. "If God wills that you shall be saved, so it will be. If not, do not spend the little time that remains in useless wailing." She gathered together their watches and jewels and put them into their pockets. Her own watch, 2 or 3 costly rings, ear jewels, and brooch, which she had forgotten to remove when she fled so hastily from Ashton Manor, she put into a little box and then gave it to Franchita, who had been silently and wonderingly watching the strangely self-possessed girl as she moved so quietly and swiftly about the rooms. "If you are saved, and I am not, will you see that this little box is sent to the Earl of Radcliffe, of Ashton Manor, Leicester, Leicestershire County, with my love, and, the pale beautiful lips quivered slightly, tell him not to mourn for me, for earth's pain will all be over for me." The girl gazed at her stupidly. "Do you understand me?" Pearle asked, giving her a little shake. "Yes, I understand. Did you say the Earl of Radcliffe?" she asked, astonishment getting the better of her fright for the moment. "Yes, he is my brother." "Your brother?" she repeated so blankly that Pearle smiled slightly in spite of her consciousness of their desperate situation.
"Yes, I will tell you now, dear," she said gently. "I am Margaret Radcliffe, and I was obliged to go away from my home on account of trouble for which I was in no way to blame. And they, Mamma and Camilla, have treated you like a slave. Camilla, do you hear? This is Margaret Radcliffe of Ashton Manor," and she shook her sister roughly to make her understand. "Never mind," Pearle interposed, and drawing her toward the window as she saw that help was near. "We have no time to lose. God bless you, my dear girl. You have been very kind to me." She kissed her tenderly, and began to help her out of the window. "I must go first. I am the oldest. I must be saved first," shrieked Camilla as she saw the act, and springing from the floor she rushed frantically to the window and began to struggle to get out. "No," Pearle answered firmly, and she dragged her back by main strength. "Franchita is the heavier, and whoever comes to our rescue must take the greatest burden first." "Come, I have come to save you," said a voice at the window, and reaching out his arms to Pearle. "No, take her," she answered, pointing to Franchita. "I shall not go until they are both safe." And her firm, undaunted look plainly told that she would not yield. With a smothered oath the man seized Franchita, helped her out upon the ladder, and conducted her down the dizzy height in safety to the ground. She did nobly, silently and quickly obeying his every command, intent on getting down as soon as possible in order that the others might be saved. Then the brave man sprang nimbly back over the steep pathway again. The smoke was pouring out of the window now, the flames were forcing their way into and all about the room, clutching everything within their reach, hurrying in a mad gallop toward those two girls at the window, one so grandly calm, the other so abject in her fear. "Come," said the man again as he reached them, and he laid his hand firmly on Pearle's arm this time. "No," she answered steadily, "I will not go until she is safe," and she forced Camilla toward his outstretched hand. Had she recognized him she might have shrunk from going with him under any circumstances. But his hair was disheveled under his slouched hat, his face blackened by smoke and cinders, and with the handkerchief tied over his mouth and nostrils, he was as effectually disguised as if he had worn a mask. "I will not take her," he cried. "You or no one," and his hold tightened upon her arm. "Do not, as you value human life, waste one single moment. I will not leave this room until I see her safe upon the ground." And with a strength that was almost superhuman, she tore herself from his grasp and almost lifted her now fainting companion over the window-sill. A look of despair leaped into his eyes, then he grasped his unconscious burden and went slowly and laboriously down the swaying ladder. Pearle was now the only inmate of that burning building. Everyone else had been rescued, and no one now had any hope that she could be saved. The room was enveloped in flames, all but a little circle where she stood. Nearer and nearer they came, rolling out their forked tongues, as if hungry and eager for their prey. The hot red smoke itself almost aflame, and the cinders poured over and around her as they rushed from the window. She stood leaning far out, brave and calm, never faltering, though she knew there was but very little hope, if any, that she could be saved. And there was no trace of fear on her marble face, no look of weakness in her solemn eyes. She was nearly suffocating with the dense atmosphere. She was panting and gasping for breath. Her wash-basin and pitcher were near where she stood. She reached out her hand and dipped her handkerchief into the water, but her delicate hand was scorched and blistered and blackened when she drew it out. She bound the wet linen about her face, and leaned still farther from that fiery furnace, seeking for air. Air! Oh, if she could but breathe a little longer! Alas! Her brave rescuer had not yet reached the ground with his other burden. A hush like that of death had fallen upon the multitude without, as with staring eyes and horror-stricken faces they watched that slight form above. Still on and on the fire demons danced. They had reached her very feet now. Her garments were singed and smoking, and again her hand was badly burned as she reached down to smother the flame that had caught her skirts. She knew she could not live 5 minutes longer in that heated, strangling air.
Already she was gasping for breath, the handkerchief about her face was steaming and drying, and she dare not reach to wet it again. Again she bent far out of the window and looked down. The flame from the window beneath had scorched and blackened the ladder. In a minute more it would ignite. A thought came to her. Dare she step out upon that frail support and begin that perilous descent by herself? The height made her dizzy and faint. She might fall and be dashed in pieces, but she must make the attempt or die where she was. There was not an instant to be lost, or she would be hopelessly enveloped in a sheet of flame. Already her feet and ankles, her hands and arms were badly burned, and the pain nearly drove her wild. One earnest, despairing cry she raised to heaven, then gathering her smoking skirts around her, she crept outside the window, and swinging slowly, carefully around, touched her feet upon the first round of the ladder. A mighty sigh swelled up from the multitude as they saw the daring act of the brave girl, then it was instantly hushed by a great fear. The man with his burden just at that moment stepped to the ground, and the sound of that sigh made him turn and look back. "Oh, God!" he cried. "Water! Give me water!" A bucketful was held before him. He deluged his face, and then turned once more to battle for human life. Every breath was again hushed, every heavy heartbeat was almost held in check, as the throng watched that slender, swaying form slowly descending, and that other springing so wildly to meet it. They could see that her strength was waning, that every time a little foot was put down upon a round its touch was less decided and secure, and a terrible fear began to take possession of each heart that the hero would be too late. No, no! On he went, nerved to greater exertions by what he himself saw and realized. A step more and he was beside her, but not a moment too soon, for her strength failed, her nerveless hands relaxed just as he put out his arms to receive her. Uttering a wild, hoarse cry, he gathered her close to him with one arm, while with the other he steadied his descending steps. A new danger menaced them now. An angry flame had seized upon the ladder. The little demon had been hiding and smouldering and watching, as it were, in that charred and smoking spot that Pearle had seen from the window above, and now burst into a lively flame, fiercely darting out its fiery tongues, stretching up and wreathing around the slender support, as if maddened by the sight of the escaping captive. Would it bear the double weight as the two passed over it? Faces blanched, lips quivered, knees trembled. But the danger was safely past. But hark! A snap, a crack, the ladder settled a trifle, and every heart stood still. For an instant that resolute man hesitated, and his body seemed to sway dizzily. The next he seemed to have gathered up his failing forces. Steadily and surely every step was taken, until at last his foot touched the solid ground once more. A wild, triumphant cheer burst from every grateful throat, eager arms were outstretched to take his unconscious burden, and then, with a deep-drawn sigh of weariness, the hero of the hour dropped exhausted to the earth. 43. Blessed tidings. The fire raged for half an hour longer before it could be got under subjection. Then it steadily subsided, although the upper story of that portion of the building was almost wholly destroyed, and the second story very badly damaged. There had been a south wind all the time, that had blown the flames away from the other portions of the great hotel, and under the ceaseless and judicious efforts of the brave firemen, who arrived from the city just about the time of Pearle's rescue, they were confined entirely to the north wing. 2 hours and a half from the time the fire was discovered, it was quelled and all danger was past. Then, and not till then, the people who had been driven in such fright from their rooms began to count up their injuries and losses. There were burns, bruises, sprains, and scratches, but not a life was lost. And when the brave proprietor, who had worked as if he had possessed the strength of a dozen men and a charmed life as well, was assured of this, his nervous face forsook him. He sank down exhausted and actually broke into grateful sobbing. Much that was valuable in the way of clothing, jewelry, and so forth had been destroyed. But nearly everyone made light of this fact in their gratitude for their escape from a dreadful death. Two strangers had reached the spot just about the time the firemen had come to the rescue, and just as Pearle had been borne to the ground in safety. One of these had rushed forward with almost frantic gestures upon learning who it was that had been in such fearful danger, and it was his arms that were outstretched to receive her, and she was borne quickly from the scene of confusion. "Come this way," said a man, touching him upon the shoulder. It was Dr. Murdoch, and he led the way to the opposite wing where his own rooms were situated. Together they bore the unconscious girl upstairs, and laid her upon the physician's own bed. Mrs. Murdoch, with tender solicitude, assisted in removing her charred and blackened clothing, and the stranger uttered a cry of pain as he saw the great blisters upon one delicate hand and arm. Both feet and ankles were also burned, the right one quite badly, so that the skin adhered to the stocking as it was removed. "A physician! Where can I find a physician?" cried the stranger, shuddering at the shocking sight, and starting wildly toward the door. "I am a physician. I know Miss Melford. Be calm, my friend, and I will do all that can be done for her," returned Dr. Murdoch, who was making a careful examination of Pearle's condition. "Is she dead? Will she die? Did the smoke suffocate her?" were the next incoherent queries which beset him. But it was something far worse than the effects of the smoke that the doctor feared, as his next words betrayed. "No, she is not dead, and if she has not inhaled the flames, I trust no serious harm has come to her," and he proceeded to apply restoratives, while Mrs. Murdoch, under his directions, bound up the burns upon her feet and hands. "Oh God, if I should lose her after all!" cried Richard Burnholm, for it was he, as he bent over her still unconscious form in agony. Dr. Murdoch glanced at him in surprise. "Are you her brother?" he asked. "No, no. Ah, she moves. She is beginning to breathe. Will she live?" And overcome by the agony of suspense, he threw himself upon his knees by the bedside, where he could watch every motion and every breath. "You will be obliged to be very calm, or I shall not consider it very proper for you to remain here," George Murdoch said with some sternness, while at the same time he searched Richard's pale, handsome face keenly. He began to think it singular that a stranger should show so much emotion. Besides, his words were unaccountable. A moan of pain now drew his attention to the bed, and Pearle's white lids slowly unclosed, only to reveal the look of agony that told something of what she was suffering from her injuries. And then unconsciousness mercifully sealed her senses again. "I do not think she is seriously injured, aside from the burns upon her limbs," he said with a sigh of relief. "She breathed all right, and I know she is not hurt otherwise, for I saw her borne down the ladder as carefully as it was possible. Her burns are quite deep, and will be very painful for a while, but 2 or 3 weeks will make them all right." Richard buried his head in the bedclothes with a smothered exclamation of thankfulness at the cheering account. Then rising, he turned with something of calmness to the physician, saying, "Is there anything that I can do? Do you need remedies from the city? Command me in any way, and I will gladly execute your behests." "There is nothing that you can do, and I have all the remedies that I need. But pardon me, do you know this young lady? Are you a friend?" George Murdoch asked, with a grave, questioning look. He knew he was not the man whom he had seen in the reception parlor with Pearle. He said he was not her brother. Who, then, could he be to evince so much emotion and solicitude, and would his presence then be agreeable to his patient when she should recover from her swoon? Were thoughts that were rather perplexing to the young man. "Do I know her?" Richard repeated with trembling lips, his whole soul in his eyes, as they rested upon the white face on the pillow. "Am I a friend? I am the dearest friend she has in all the world." But, Miss Melford has told me that," began the doctor, looking extremely confused at this strange announcement. "You cannot comprehend the propriety of my claim, since, as I perceive, she has confided to you that someone has a superior one upon her," Richard interrupted with a smile, and laying his hand confidentially upon George Murdoch's shoulder. "But, my friend," he added, "this dear girl is more to me than my own life, and there are mysteries connected with her past and mine which I will gladly explain to you when she is sufficiently recovered for you to leave her." The doctor was satisfied. There was no mistaking the look of truth and the honesty of purpose in the frank, manly face looking into his. His brow cleared, and he turned to Pearle, who was beginning to show signs of consciousness once more. "If it is as you say, sit there, where her eyes can rest upon you. Her system has sustained a severe shock, and if there is any way to prevent a relapse of these faintings, we must improve it." And he pointed to a chair close beside the sufferer. Richard obeyed and waited in silence, and with what patience he could summon to his aid, for those dear eyes to unclose once more. He had not long to wait, for the restoratives were doing their work, and the terrible pain from her burns was asserting itself. She stirred restlessly, moaned, and then looked up helplessly and appealingly into the face bending so anxiously over her. A startled look came into her eyes for an instant, then a glad smile irradiated her face in spite of her great suffering. "Richard," she whispered. "Yes, my darling. I have come to take you home." "Was it you that saved me?" she asked with a shudder. "No, dear, I do not know who the brave man was, but I shall bless him for the deed as long as I live," he murmured gratefully, and with his trembling hand he smoothed her tangled hair back from her brow. Neither of them dreamed of the test to which their gratitude would be put when they should discover who had risked his life to save hers. Dr. Murdoch now gave her something to drink, and wet her bandaged limbs with some cooling lotion. "I fear I am badly burned," she said, shivering from the pain, which as she came more to herself began to be intolerable. "Yes, you are, my dear young lady," he said pitifully, "and the next few hours will require all your fortitude. But we will do the very best we can for your relief." But the brave girl who had stood unflinchingly in that window, with those flames almost enveloping her, and had calmly faced death, was not one to weakly give up to physical suffering. The pain was well nigh unbearable for the next 6 hours, but though her small hands were clenched with agony, and her usually fair smooth brow contracted, her great grey eyes almost wild in their expression, yet no murmur escaped her lips. No look or gesture of impatience was apparent in her manner. Above and over all her suffering was the consciousness that Richard, her beloved, was there. She knew not why nor wherefore, but it was nevertheless a great comfort. Through all those long hours of pain he never left his post beside her. His tender hands ministered to her. His pitiful eyes looked the sympathy which his great heart experienced, and told her that he would gladly have borne it all for her had it been possible for him to do so. The intense agony was over at last, and weak and exhausted, Pearle dropped into a profound slumber. Richard then stole quietly from the chamber to see if he could contribute in any way to the comfort of others who might be suffering in the same way. But Pearle appeared to be the only one who was injured to any extent, and everyone was anxious for the brave girl who had so heroically faced death for the sake of others. It will be remembered that Richard Burnholm and Sir Harold Cheswick left London immediately after learning from Lord Fennelsey that Pearle was governess in his mother's family. They reached Vannes on a late train on the night of the fire, and being "hungry as a pair of wolves," as Sir Harold expressed it, they had ordered a hearty supper, which it of course took some time to prepare. They had scarcely finished their repast when the alarm of fire was given, and great was the consternation upon learning that the great hotel and water cure in the suburbs of the city was in flames. With much of anxiety and fear in their hearts, they hastened with all speed to the place where they arrived just as Addison Cheetham, for he was the hero who had so gallantly saved their lives, was descending the ladder with his last burden. Almost the first person that Sir Harold had encountered was Lady Fennelsey, who was rejoicing and weeping over her daughters who had just been restored to her. "Are there any more in the building?" Sir Harold asked. "No, she is the last one," she said, pointing to the unconscious form being borne down the ladder. "Who is she?" he demanded with a sinking heart, for his keen eye had been roving around to discover Pearle. "The young lady who was my governess, Miss Melfort," she said, bursting into another fit of weeping. Richard Burnholm waited to hear no more, but darted frantically forward, and thrusting aside every eager outstretched hand, seized his darling in his arms and bore her away without a word of explanation as to his right to do so. Now that all danger was past, and no one needed his services, his thoughts naturally turned to the brave man to whom he felt that he owed so much. He sought Sir Harold to ascertain if he had discovered who he was, but he had not, although he had made inquiries to that effect. Even Lady Fennelsey could not tell who had saved her daughters, and no one appeared to have paid any attention to him, or knew anything about him beyond the fact that he had accomplished a heroic act. He had appeared to revive after a few moments, and though apparently much exhausted, had hobbled away from the crowd and disappeared. And so, for the time, Richard was obliged to reserve the expressions of his gratitude. The excitement had now in a great measure subsided, and comparative order had been restored after the confusion. Everybody was very kind and accommodating. People who had suites of rooms shared them with the unfortunate ones who had been so ruthlessly deprived of theirs, and did everything in their power to render the sufferers comfortable. Lady Fennelsey and her children were provided with comfortable rooms, and she hovered tenderly around her daughters, who, although uninjured, were the same as restored from the dead to her. She, with the 2 younger children, had been among the first to escape from the burning building, and she had been a terribly interested witness of all that had transpired at Pearl's window. She had been the first to discover those 3 white, scared faces looking forth from it. She had seen Pearle clasp Camilla in her arms and insist that Franchita should go first when that brave man had gone to their rescue. This act nearly drove her frantic. Her warped nature could not comprehend the grand thoughts that had actuated her, and the thoughtfulness that had planned so wisely. In her terror and suspense, she had thought that Pearle now intended to be revenged upon her eldest daughter for all the abuse and insult that she had received at her hands. She scarce noticed Franchita when she reached the ground in safety. Her whole heart and mind were concentrated upon what should happen next. She moaned and wrung her hands constantly. "She will perish! She will perish!" she cried helplessly, as she saw the man reach the window, and lay his hand upon Pearl's arm, bidding her come. Then she saw the brave girl raise her own unconscious daughter in her arms and force her into those outstretched hands, while she drew back and firmly motioned that she would not go until his burden was safe. And when the grateful mother received her daughter unharmed, she was fairly dazed with wonder at an act so entirely above and beyond her comprehension. She could not understand that divine love, that heroism, that could make one thus sacrifice her life for an enemy. After all was over, and Camilla restored to consciousness, she learned all that had transpired from Franchita, who could not say enough to express her gratitude and admiration for Miss Melfort. "If she had left us there," she said with a white face and solemn eyes, "we must have been burned to death, for we were both so crazed with fright that we were perfectly helpless. Why, mamma, she actually dressed us as if we had been children, and when that man told her that he had come to save her, she told him that she should not move from the place until we were both safe. If she had perished, mamma, I should never have known another happy moment," the girl concluded, weeping almost hysterically at the remembrance. Lady Fennelsey was very repentant and remorseful. "I have treated her shamefully. I have wronged her deeply. I wonder if she can ever forgive me," she said, sobbing, and completely unnerved, and for the first time in her life her pride was utterly humbled. Later in the day she went to Dr. Murdoch and begged to see his patient, but he told her that Pearle was sleeping, and would be able to see no one save her own friends for several days. Then she found Sir Harold and relieved her burdened heart to him, confessing her injustice to the beautiful girl, and telling him all that had occurred since they came to Vannes. In this way Richard learned all that had befallen his loved one, and discovered also that, even as he feared, Addison Cheetham had followed her there, and was doubtless even then an inmate of the hotel. "We did not arrive a moment too soon," he said to Sir Harold when he told him what he had learned from Lady Fennelsey, "and I fear if I meet him I shall not be accountable for what may happen to him." "Do not be rash, my boy," Sir Harold answered. "Remember who alone has a right to mete out justice and vengeance. No harm has come to our friend, and of course we shall take everything into our own hands now. I think on the whole that it is well we all meet here. All matters can be settled at once, and we shall return with no fear of any further disturbance or trouble." End of chapters 42 and 43. Chapter 44 of Lost, a Pearl by Georgie Sheldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 44. Face to Face. Several days went by, and many of those who had been deprived of their rooms by the fire returned to their homes, while others sought board in the cottages nearby, and some went into the city to remain for the present. Pearle was gaining rapidly. Although she suffered much from the soreness of her burns, she was otherwise uninjured, and after a few days of rest and quiet she felt quite like herself again. "I'm as good as new, except for being a little crippled," she said one day with a very bright face, as Richard entered and inquired regarding her condition. He had haunted the doctor's rooms ever since the fire, and would have waited upon Pearle constantly, but the young physician deemed it more prudent that his charge should have only his mother's care until he was fully assured that she would experience no ill effects from the terrible ordeal through which she had passed. He allowed Captain Bernholm to see her for a few moments every day, but would consent to no protracted conversation or explanations. Pearle, on her part, often found herself wondering what had brought him there. She knew it must be something in connection with herself, but of the nature of his mission she could form no idea, and was too languidly content and happy to have him there, in case of an emergency, to trouble herself about the matter. She wondered, too, if Addison Cheetham was still there. She asked Dr. Murdoch a day or two after the fire, but he had not seen anything of him and could not tell her. Pearle, however, did not fret or worry over it. Richard had told her that Sir Harold Cheswick was there also, and with two such stanch protectors at hand she felt assured that no harm could come near her. Alice Renault was improving wonderfully every day. She was gaining both in flesh and strength, and a faint beautiful colour was taking the place of the deadly pallor which her face had always worn since her accident. Her eyes grew bright, her mind clearer and stronger, and fond, lovely smiles came readily to her sweet lips as she listened to Amy's childish prattle. She no longer occupied her invalid chair. That was given up to Pearle now, while she sat by her side and talked over the past, eager to learn every event that had transpired. She had been greatly astonished upon being told that more than a year had elapsed since that dreadful day, but was forced to believe it when she saw how Amy had grown. Her relations with George Murdoch were strangely changed during this last week. Of course to her he was like a stranger. She had no knowledge or remembrance of him, while to him it seemed as if a mountain-like barrier had suddenly risen between him and the gentle, helpless girl whom he had watched and tended for so long. Whenever she was in his presence, his eyes would follow every movement of her graceful figure with a strangely fascinated, half-wondering gaze, and often he would start and heave a deep sigh when aroused to a sense of what he was doing. Many times, on glancing up, Alice would find his dark eyes fixed upon her with such a sad, earnest, almost imploring look, that a vivid colour would mount to her brow, and a feeling of embarrassment would impel her to make some excuse for leaving the room to escape it. One bright morning, the 4th day after the fire, Richard tapped for admittance upon Pearle's door. A sweet, well-known voice bade him enter, and with a glad light in his handsome face he obeyed. With a quick, elastic tread he crossed the room to her side. Pearle's heart always bounded at his coming, and yet a feeling of sadness, a sort of guilty reproachfulness, took possession of her heart while in his presence. What right had the blood to leap more quickly in her veins at the sound of his footstep? Why should the colour fly to her cheek and her eyes droop consciously before him? Were questions which she sternly asked herself after every interview with him. Today there was something in his quick, light step that sent the blood tingling through all her frame, and as he reached her chair, the crimson in her cheeks told all too plainly how his presence moved her. She could not look up. She felt guilty, condemned, and yet strangely happy, and before she was aware of his intention, he had stooped, taken her glowing face between his hands, raised it so that he could look full into it, and then kissed her softly, almost reverently, upon her lips. "Richard!" she cried in a startled, almost distressed tone, while the colour faded out of her face, leaving it white and full of pain. "Pearle, forgive me," he said, seeming to remember something, "but I could not help it. You looked so exactly like my Pearle of Ashton Manor." She made no reply, but her bright brown head drooped still lower than before. A tremulous sigh welled up from her aching heart. Her lips trembled painfully, and the tears stood upon her long lashes. It seemed cruel when she loved him so, when she was weak and could not hide it, that he should come and probe her wound thus. But Richard Burnham's face was strangely luminous. "Look up, my peerless Pearle. Do you think I would come to you and wound you thus if I did not bring you hope, joy? Dearest, look into my eyes. Let me read in yours the light of the olden time, while I tell you some blessed tidings," he said as he knelt upon the footstool before her, and taking both her hands drew her tenderly toward him. Her eyes were lifted now in startled surprise. What tidings that could be blessed tidings could he possibly have for her? He had once suggested the measure of having her marriage annulled. Could it be that he and her brother had succeeded in having it made null and void, and he had come to seek her to tell her of it? Could either of them believe that she would be willing to marry her old lover while Addison Cheetham lived? How strangely they had mistaken her character if they thought so, and Richard had no right to assume his old manner toward her until he had heard her decision regarding the matter. But he looked so joyous, so handsome, so assured that his blessed tidings would bring her joy also. "Darling," he went on, drawing her nearer, "do not look so troubled, so grave and serious. I must do something to banish that sad reproach from your eyes. Listen." But at that instant there came another knock upon the door. With an expression of annoyance, Richard arose and went to open it. Sir Harold Cheswick stood upon the threshold. "Do I intrude?" he asked as he saw Richard. "Not at all. Come in," he answered, a smile chasing the irritation from his brow. And yet he did wish he had waited a little longer. He so wanted to see Pearle smile one of her old joyous smiles again. But he led him directly to the fair girl sitting by the window. "Pearle," he said, "I bring you an old friend. Sir Harold Cheswick, allow me to introduce to you Miss Margaret Radcliffe of Ashton Manor." Pearle greeted her kind friend most cordially, although the telltale blood in her cheeks betrayed that she had not forgotten a little episode that had occurred during her sojourn in his home. She wondered, too, that Richard should have introduced her by her maiden name. Surely it must mean that they had succeeded in annulling her marriage. But Sir Harold did not give her time to muse over the past. His manner was very friendly and perfectly free from all restraint, and he began chatting in the most cheerful manner. "How are the burns?" he asked, after bantering Richard upon having turned nurse, and such a successful one too, with a glance at her rosy cheeks. "Pretty sore, thank you, but healing nicely, the doctor says," she answered, smiling, though her colour deepened. "I never thought to see you alive again. I feared you were suffocated when I saw that man bringing you down that ladder," he said gravely. "I wonder who it was who braved so much for me," Pearle said, and looking thoughtfully out of the open window where she sat. Almost instantly she drew back, uttering a terrified cry. "What is it, Pearle?" Richard demanded, startled at the death-like paleness that was overspreading her face. "Nothing, nothing," she said, hastily and struggling to regain composure. Then she turned to Sir Harold and began to ask him some questions regarding the amount of damages the fire had done. Richard watched her uneasily. That something had disturbed her greatly he could see, for she was trembling, although she strove to conceal it, while she kept glancing anxiously from the window. The truth was this. On looking out of the window, which was open to admit the pure air, for the day was warm, Pearle had espied Addison Cheetham directly underneath, and he, attracted by the sound of her voice, had raised his eyes at that moment and had seen her. The sight affected her strangely, for she was still weak. She did not fear him. She knew that there were too many friends around her for him to do her any harm, but at the same time his presence excited her, although she tried to go on with her conversation with Sir Harold as if nothing had occurred. "I hear, Miss Radcliffe," he said, appearing not to mind her emotion, "that during your exile you have adopted a witching little fairy. Is she here with you? I should like to see her." "Certainly you shall see her, but I fear I am about to lose her again," Pearle answered sadly. "Ah? How so?" "It is a long story, Sir Harold, and I have not yet been able to relate it, even to Captain Burnholm.
I was intending to do so today, and you shall both hear it after you have seen Amy." She touched a bell that stood beside her on the table, and Mrs. Murdoch immediately came into the room to see what her charge wanted. Pearle introduced her to Sir Harold, and then asked to have Amy sent to her. 10 minutes later, the beautiful child came dancing into the room, her happy face wreathed in smiles, and her golden hair flying over her plump shoulders, while she was clad in the daintiest and whitest of garments. She went directly to the baronet at Pearle's command, and laying her tiny hand in his, looked up into his face with grave, serious eyes for a moment. It was a way she had with everyone who was a stranger to her. The scrutiny seemed to be entirely satisfactory, for when he lifted her upon his knee she settled herself contentedly in his lap, and began to play with the diamond-studded seal attached to his watch-chain. At this moment loud and excited voices were heard in the corridor, then the door of their room was thrown violently open, and Addison Cheetham strode boldly in, followed by Dr. Murdoch with a very red and angry face. Pearle uttered a cry of dismay, while Amy, with a frightened look, jumped from her perch, flew to her side, and clung trembling to her neck. Sir Harold and Richard Burnholm both sprang to their feet and confronted the unceremonious visitor. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" demanded Richard sternly. "Intrusion, indeed," was the mocking retort. "I should rather think it belonged to me to put that question to you," and he strode fiercely toward Richard, who was standing before Pearle as if to shield her. "I have come for my wife," he continued, with a scowl at the shrinking girl. "I have been trying to discover what room she occupied ever since the fire, and only ascertained a few moments ago by seeing her at the window yonder." Ah, that explained to Richard her emotion when she had looked out. "Your wife," he repeated with peculiar emphasis, and with something like a warning ring in his tones. "Yes, my wife. I claim her in defiance of everything. She is mine, and no power on earth shall wrest her from me now," he answered savagely, and advancing a step or two toward where Pearle sat. Sir Harold here interposed. He placed himself directly in front of the desperate man and looked him calmly in the eye. "We will settle this matter once and for all. Miss Radcliffe is not your wife. She has never been your wife, and you know it as well as I. Leave this room instantly, or I will cause you to be arrested for bigamy." "Bigamy?" gasped Pearle, white and trembling, and gazing from one to the other, a look of horror in her great eyes. Richard turned, reached down, and clasped her well hand in his, while Sir Harold continued, with a glance of compassion into her colourless face. "Yes, or at least attempted bigamy. Thank heaven that some kind angel prompted you to fly from him as you did, and that you have been protected from evil designs during all these months. But, my dear friend, let your heart be at rest from this moment, for this man had a wife living at the time he compelled you to go through with that mockery so long ago." Pearle heard him as in a dream. Was it all a dream? Would she soon awake and find it but a vision? No, that strong hand clasping hers, that tender face bending over her were real. She knew that they were telling her only the truth. But the reaction, the great wild throb of joy at her heart, was almost too much for her, and for a moment it seemed as if her senses were slipping away from her. She was no wife. She had never been a wife. No obligations, either moral or civil, bound her to this man, against whom all her nature revolted. She was free, blessed thought, free as she had ever been in her happy girlhood days, and all these weary months of toil and suffering had been for naught. For naught, have they? She thought, catching her breath quickly. No, she murmured, bowing her head reverently, her heart growing quiet with a solemn thankfulness. Not one day of my suffering has been for naught, since it has led me to God. Pearle, my Pearle, now and forever, whispered Richard in trembling tones. These were the blessed tidings which I came to tell you. That is why we are both here. We discovered some time ago that this wretch had another wife, and we have been seeking you ever since. A smothered sob of joy and relief was her only answer, but she clung to his hand in a way that thrilled him.
It told him that she was his once more, that henceforth she would rest in the shelter of his love and care. "It is false!" Addison Cheetham burst forth passionately in reply to Sir Harold's statements. "You have tried to frighten me once before with the same story, when you two came down to Pelham Pines and accused me of this crime, thinking, I suppose, that your proofs were indisputable because you had happened to come across a couple of names recorded in a church register. But as you know, I was not so easily alarmed, and when you were gone, I laughed you to scorn and vowed that I would checkmate you after all." Sir Harold Cheswick and Richard Burnholm were indeed the visitors whom Addison Cheetham had been telegraphed home from Scotland to meet. That record which they had discovered seemingly by accident in the little church at Bar-le-Duc, and which had so startled Sir Harold and so utterly unmanned Richard, was the record of a marriage between Addison Cheetham and Alice Marie Renaud. It was there that the baronet obtained a clue to the man who had so wronged the girl he was seeking, and Richard learned that there was a possibility, indeed a probability, that Pearle was no wife. That she was as free as air, and might have been happy in his love during all these months. The knowledge came like a thunderbolt to him, making him nearly insane for the time with grief and rage and a wild newborn hope, although his friend tried to curb his excitement, fearing that a second disappointment might prove fatal to him. On talking the matter over more calmly on their way back to Paris, they decided to go at once and confront Addison Cheetham, and charge him with the crime of bigamy. But after the first shock which their unexpected presence had given him, he became so cool and insolent, and was so defiant and indifferent to their charges, and by neither word nor look gave them the least light on the subject, that they began to fear they had deceived themselves, that there might be another Addison Cheetham who was the husband of Alice Renaud. Though how that could be when the Curé had described him so exactly was more than they could account for. And after a stormy interview on their part, they had left Pelham Pines somewhat discouraged, although Richard had another strong reason for hope, as will hereafter appear. Their next plan was to find Pearle, tell her of their discovery, induce her to return to Ashton Manor, and cheer her with this new hope. It has been related how they discovered where she was, and how they hastened after her, hoping to reach her before Addison Cheetham should find her. They were somewhat dismayed upon learning that he had reached the place 2 days before them, but much relieved to find that no harm had come to Pearle from his scheme, and now they were prepared to fight out the great final battle. But it seems that the villain was as confident of his position and as defiant now as when they had visited him in his own home. But at the same time there was something in his manner, a restless, anxious gleam in his eye, that convinced Sir Harold that he was not quite so sure as he appeared. "Cease!" he almost thundered. "You know that more than 6, yes, nearly 7 years ago, you won the love of a pure and lovely girl. You enticed her with false, smooth words to leave her home and go to a distant town where you were married. I have already shown you a copy of the record of your marriage. I have it with me now, however, if you would like to see it again," and he drew the paper from his pocket and held it out for him to take. "Bah! What do I care for that record?" he cried scornfully. "It is true that, fascinated by her beauty, I recklessly married Alice Renaud, but—" "Alice Renaud? Amy? Oh, Richard!" Pearle cried hoarsely, as this startling intelligence fell upon her ear. "This man, Alice Renaud's husband? This man, Amy's father?" "Yes, dear, it is true, strange as it appears. But listen, and you shall know all," Richard whispered. "But what?" Sir Harold demanded of Addison Cheetham, as he paused at Pearle's interruption and eyed her keenly. Neither he nor Richard had yet learned anything of either Amy or Alice beyond the fact that Pearle had adopted a child. "But she died long before I became acquainted with Margaret Radcliffe," he answered with a malicious leer at Richard. "How do you know that she died? What proof have you of her death?" Sir Harold asked somewhat eagerly. A sinister smile curved the man's lips as, drawing forth that wallet that we have seen before, he took from it that slip of paper which he had read in his room at the Langham Hotel, and passed it to Sir Harold. "Read that," he said, but his face had grown very white despite his assured manner. The baronet took it and read aloud. "Died at Chalons, April 20th, 1800 —, of smallpox, Alice Renault, aged 19. A look of perplexity clouded the baronet's face for a moment. The next it cleared, and he said, "There is a mistake about this. Either some carelessness in writing the notice, or a misprint has deceived you. It should read thus: died at Chalon, April 20th, 1800 of smallpox, Alec Renault, aged 79. Monsieur Renault's brother Alec returned from Australia shortly after Mademoiselle Alice disappeared from her home with you. He brought a large fortune with him, and which, after she came back to her home, heartbroken at your treatment of her, and he was attacked with that terrible disease of which he knew he must die, he willed to her. I am connected with the family. I know that Monsieur Alec Renault died on the 20th of April, 1800 of smallpox, and was 79 years of age. Alec and Alice are so nearly alike that the mistake in the name is easily accounted for, while the upper part of the 7 being obliterated makes the age read 19. "Do you think I am to be cheated by any such sophistry as this?" Addison Cheetham demanded, waxing angry. "Do you think I am such a fool that a cunningly devised tale like this is going to frighten me into yielding up my claim upon my wife yonder?" But his lips and his voice trembled as he said it. "I have no wish to cheat you, as you express it," said Sir Harold gravely. "As I said before, I am a connection of the family, and I have a fortune in my possession to be made over to this same Mademoiselle Renault, or Mrs. Cheetham, whenever I shall find her. I have visited her home, and have been told by an old servant, and by the curé, that it was her uncle who died, and that she, with her mother and child, left the place very suddenly several months afterward, and I feel as confident that she is alive today as that I myself am living." Pearle had leaned forward as if to speak, but something in Addison Cheetham's appearance deterred her. He was very white, and he trembled visibly as, leaning towards Sir Harold, he asked, "What if I should tell you that I saw her after she was dead?" "I should say that I do not believe it," he answered quietly. "It is nevertheless true. The last time I looked upon her face she was dead." His voice dropped to a whisper, and he shuddered as he said it. "Impossible!" Sir Harold ejaculated, regarding him searchingly, while Richard grew strangely excited, and Pearle was perfectly colourless as she hugged Amy almost convulsively to her. All had been so deeply interested in the above conversation that no one had noticed that Mrs. Murdoch had entered the room almost at the beginning of it, and had left the door through which she had entered open. No one noticed now the slight figure in a dainty white wrapper, with face and lips as hueless as the spotless cambric, that glided noiselessly into the room. It was Alice Renault, and no one seemed conscious of her presence until she approached the spot where Sir Harold and Addison Cheetham stood, and confronting the latter said, in tones which penetrated the farthest corner of that large room, "I am Alice Renault. I am your wife." End of chapter 44. Chapters 45 and 46 of Lost, a Pearl, by Georgie Sheldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 45. I thought she was dead. A terrible silence pervaded the room for a few moments after those thrilling words. Then everyone became strangely excited. Addison Cheetham uttered a hoarse, affrighted cry, and sank trembling into a chair, looking as if he had seen a spirit from another world. Dr. Murdoch threw out his hands with an appealing gesture, and then reeled where he stood as if someone had struck him a deadly blow. His mother alone saw it, but too well she knew what it meant, and her heart ached for the hopes so ruthlessly blighted. "That story is told," Pearle murmured, and kissing Amy with trembling lips and sad eyes, as if the thought of consigning her to such a father was more than she could bear. Then lifting her face to Richard, a smile broke over it, like a gleam of sunlight through the clouds. "It is all over," she said, leaning her head trustfully against his arm. "What is all over, my darling?" "The misery and pain, the loneliness and exile," she answered, with a sob of joy. "Do you know her? Who is she?" Richard asked, pointing to Alice, and as much surprised at her appearance as anyone. "Yes, she is Amy's mother. Don't you remember I told Sir Harold that I feared I should have to lose the child? It was because we had found the mother." "How was she lost? What had happened to her?" Richard asked eagerly. "She was supposed to be dead, killed in a railway accident." "Huh!" he cried with a start, and bending a peculiar glance upon Addison Cheetham. Sir Harold's face was a perfect blank for the space of a minute, then, with an effort to recover himself, he gently laid his hand upon Alice's shoulder and asked, "My dear, is it possible that you are Alice Renaud?" "My name for nearly 7 years has been Alice Cheetham," she said with a scornful curl of her delicate lip. "But," she added sadly, "I was once so happy as to bear that of Alice Renaud." "Then I have at last found the one for whom I have been searching," the baronet said, smiling. "Yes, I heard you say something about it while I stood listening in the next room, but I don't quite understand it," she answered with a puzzled expression. "Your father's name was Jean Renaud?" "Yes, monsieur." "And he was the brother of Pierre Renaud?" "I knew papa had a brother of that name, although I never saw him," Alice answered absently, while her troubled glance wandered to the miserable cowering wretch whom she had so suddenly confronted and claimed as her husband, thus upsetting in an instant all his vile schemes regarding Pearle. "Then," continued Sir Harold, "you are cousin to my wife, who was the only child of Pierre Renaud." Alice looked up at him now, something of interest shining in her eyes. "Then you must be Sir Harold Cheswick? I have heard of you," she said. "Yes, I am that individual, and I have been wanting to find you in order to get rid of a fortune which rightly belongs to you," he said, smiling again. "I heard you say so, but I don't understand it," Alice answered with a sigh, as if there were matters that troubled her more just now than the want of a fortune. "I will explain," Sir Harold replied. "My wife died some time before her father, your uncle, and he, knowing that I and my child had plenty of the world's goods, made a will dividing his property equally between his brothers Alec and Jean. Both, however, are dead, and you alone live to inherit all. I have been told that Alec Renaud returned from Australia with a handsome property. Is it true?" "Yes. Uncle Alec was quite rich, and he left everything to me," Alice answered. "I am very glad that I have found you at last. But is this man indeed your husband?" Sir Harold asked, with a gesture toward Addison Cheetham. She sighed heavily at the question. "Yes, we were married in a little church in Bar-le-Duc nearly 7 years ago. I never would have owned it, I never would have come into his presence," she went on wearily. "But I heard his voice when Mrs. Murdoch opened the door. I knew it at once, though I had not heard it for so long. I heard him trying to prove that I was dead, and I knew that it must be to carry out some evil design of his own. I could not hear enough to understand what he wanted to do, but I resolved that he should never deceive anyone again as he had deceived me. He should never make anyone as miserable as he has made me, and that was why I came into the room." "And what have you to say for yourself now, sir?" demanded Sir Harold sternly, and turning to the wretched husband whose face was as white as his wife's wrapper. I thought she was dead," he stammered, too thoroughly unnerved to even attempt to deny that the woman before him was his wife. "Well, you see, she is not," Sir Harold said impatiently. But I swear that I saw her dead. Upon my oath, I believed her dead and buried," he murmured with white lips. "When did you see her dead?" cried Richard Burnholm eagerly, and now coming forward. Addison Cheetham shifted uncomfortably in his chair, and glanced uneasily at Pearle. "When did you see her dead?" Richard repeated with lowering brow. "I saw her. There was a railway accident a long time ago. I was on the train. Someone had been killed. A woman, they said. I went to look at her, and by heaven, as sure as I am a living man, it was my wife who was killed," he said, greatly excited, while he kept glancing nervously into Alice's pure, beautiful face, an expression of awe on his own. His teeth chattered, and the perspiration stood thick upon his forehead. "It was I who was supposed to have been killed at that time," Alice began, but Richard interrupted. "Yes, I know you believed she was killed," he said in a choking voice, "for when you looked upon her you cried out involuntarily, My God, how came she here?" Addison Cheetham glanced up at him in surprise, while his white face suddenly reddened to the roots of his hair. "You look surprised," Richard continued with bitter sarcasm, "and well you may, for I was on that train also, although I did not know that you were traveling with me until I happened to come up behind you as you stood looking at that unfortunate girl, and heard you cry out as you did. I was the only one who knew where the cry came from, and I was at once convinced that there was some mystery in your life connected with that young and beautiful woman, and I resolved to watch you. I heard what you said to your valet on leaving the train in London. I followed you to your hotel, and from there the next day to the morgue, where you went to assure yourself that you had not been deceived." Richard paused an instant, and his brow grew fearfully dark as he resumed. "You knew then that she was your wife. You may have believed up to that time that she had died of smallpox, as you assert. But you were convinced then that she had been living up to the time of that accident, and that did not occur until more than a week after your marriage with Miss Radcliffe. Consequently, you knew that the ceremony was nothing but a mockery, and you had no legal claim upon her. You have dared to persecute her during all this time. You have dared to seek her ruin by trying to make her assume a position as loathsome to her as it was sinful in the sight of God and man. How will you answer for all this, sir?" The man cowered almost abjectly beneath the force of his passion. The stern, sharp words seemed to cut him like a knife. "I thought, as long as she, pointing his shaking finger at Alice, was really dead, that no one would ever know, and what?" thundered Richard. "I loved her so," the wretch whispered hoarsely, while his despairing eyes sought Pearle's lovely face. There could be no doubt of the truth of what he said. His look, his tone, his despair all told of the deathless love that was consuming him, and notwithstanding all that Richard Burnholm had suffered at his hands, a feeling of pity swept through his heart as he comprehended it. "It was a strangely selfish love, methinks, that could thus seek the ruin of its object," was his scornful reply, as he turned in disgust from him whom he had once honored as his friend, and went back to his post by Pearle's side. "It seems to me that things have been strangely mixed up," said Sir Harold. Then turning to Alice, he continued, "Would you be willing to tell us about your marriage with this man, and how you came to be separated from him? I doubt not it will be painful for you to speak of it, but we are all your friends, and I confess there are some things that I do not quite understand even yet."
"Yes, monsieur, I will tell you, and I think an explanation is due others who have been so kind to me," Alice returned tremulously, as her eyes sought Dr. Murdoch's face. He started as he met her glance, and a spasm of pain contracted his forehead, but he grasped a chair, and rolling it forward, he said, "Sit here. You are not strong enough to stand," and everyone noticed the deathly whiteness of his face, and the wildness of his eyes, as he glanced from the fair young wife to the man whom she had acknowledged as her husband. He then withdrew to a remote corner of the room, where, with arms tightly folded across his chest, and his head bent low upon his breast, he listened to the strange tale of wrong and suffering that followed. Sir Harold seated himself near his relative, and Amy, stealing softly forward, crept into her mother's arms, where she was folded to her heart with a sweet tremulous smile, which told that in spite of the bitterness of the past there yet remained a ray of comfort to her. "I was 16 years old," she began, "when one summer's day, as I was going from my home to the town, I met a stranger. There was something about him that strangely attracted me from the first. He saluted me courteously, and inquired the way to some place farther on. I directed him, and he left me, and I gave the circumstance no thought beyond mentally remarking upon his fine appearance. If I had never seen him again, all would have been well, but after that, wherever I went I met him. It always happened as if by chance, but he afterward told me that he was pleased with me and sought me continually. One day I met him at a fete, where he waited upon me and danced with me several times, and our acquaintance progressed rapidly after that. In 2 months I was betrothed to him, and he wanted me to go away with him and be privately married, but this I resisted for a long time. I did not like the idea of a secret marriage. I had heard of so many young girls who had been wronged and deceived in that way. I asked him why he did not go to my father and openly ask for me, if his intentions were honorable, but his excuse was that he was poor, he was still at school, and he did not wish his companions to know that he had a wife. If I would only marry him, and he could have that as an incentive to work, he would win such a place for me in the world when he had completed his education that I should be proud of. I told him I would wait. I would be faithful until he could come and ask me of my father, but he would not listen to me. I must marry him then, or not at all, and go away with him without saying anything to anyone. At last, after thinking the matter all over, I told him if he would marry me in church as a pure and honorable woman should be wedded, I would consent, and agree to keep the matter a secret until he should get through his course of study. It did not please him very well to have the ceremony quite so public, but we went one day to a little church in Bar-le-Duc, and were married by the curé, and the ring was put on my finger. But when the book was brought, my husband did not wish to have our names written there. It would not matter, he said. I insisted, however, and with a rather stern face he wrote his, and I signed mine underneath. We then went to a quiet little town where we spent a happy month. At the end of that time my husband said he must return to his school, and I must remain where I was until he had another holiday. I would have been glad to go back to my home, tell my father what I had done, and ask his forgiveness, but this my husband would not consent to, so I lived quietly where I was, until the next summer when he returned to me, and soon after my baby, this child, Amy, was born.
"Then she is our child. This is our little girl," Addison Cheetham said, leaning eagerly forward, and peering into Amy's face. The child shrank from him with a scowl, while Alice bowed her head in answer to his question. "I thought it. I mistrusted it long ago," he muttered under his breath, as he sank back to his former position. "My baby was nearly 6 months old, when one day we read in a paper a notice of my father's death," Alice continued in a tremulous voice. "Then my husband told me that I could go home if I liked. 'You will be an heiress now. You will inherit all the property,' he said with more eagerness than I had ever seen him manifest." "An heiress? The property?" I cried in astonishment, for I had supposed that he knew how very poor we had been for a long time. "Why, your father was very rich, a sort of miser, was he not? And you will have all his wealth now," he answered. Then I understood what he meant. There had been a story afloat one while that there was a great deal of money in the Renault family. Everybody knew that Papa's brother in Paris was very rich, and naturally thought that Papa must have as much, but being of a miserly turn tried to conceal the fact from everyone. And it seems my husband had heard this story and believed it. "No, we have never been rich," I told him. "We have been very poor for many years, for Papa's health was delicate, and he could not attend to the estate properly, and that, being our sole dependence, had run to waste." Then he was very angry with me. "I have been deceived," he said. "They told me that Monsieur Renault was very rich and a miser, and that at his death you, his only child, would have all the gold he has been hiding for many years." It was a great mistake, I told him. There was nothing to inherit, save the impoverished estates. Papa was not a miser, and if he had been there was nothing for him to hide. He had managed to give me a good education by sending me to a convent at Chalon for 2 or 3 years, but it was a hard matter for us to get sufficient to eat and to clothe us decently, for Papa was much too proud to ask aid from even his brother in Paris, who never so much as came to see him. Then my husband swore he had been basely deceived by everyone, and included me in his displeasure, and from that time his manner changed entirely. He began to abuse and neglect me in many ways. My eyes were opened. I saw him as he was. He had won me and married me simply because he expected to become rich through me, and that hope taken from him he became a selfish tyrant, almost a fiend. I bore it as long as I could for my child's sake, and because my pride forbade me going back to the dear ones whom I had so wronged. I bore it till every bit of love for him died out of my heart, and then in despair I took my baby and went home to my mother. She told me that my father never held up his head after I went away. He believed I had been tempted and ruined, and he just grieved himself to death.
but he forgave me when he was dying and left me his blessing if I should ever come back. For a time it seemed as if my own heart would break with my own trouble and the knowledge of all the grief I had caused. I saw no one, and no one came to see me. Everybody believed I had been deceived and betrayed, and I was too miserable to care anything about it, or to contradict the story, and so my mother, baby, and I lived a quiet, almost isolated life, until Uncle Alec suddenly returned to us. 46. Avenged. He, my uncle, Alice continued, had many plans for us. He would restore the estate, he would repair the chateau, refurnish it, and make it more beautiful than it had ever been. My mother and I should have everything we wished. We should travel and see the world, and in fact, there was nothing which he would not do for us, for he had no family of his own, no home, no friends save ourselves. I told him my sad story, and he was very tender and pitiful with me. He said he would take care of me, and my false husband should never trouble me, and I, being of a cheerful disposition, naturally began to feel as if there might be some pleasure remaining for me, in spite of my misfortunes. But Uncle Alec had only been with us a few weeks when he was suddenly attacked with smallpox. As soon as he discovered what the nature of his disease was, he refused to have any member of the family come near him. He hired a professional nurse, and neither my mother nor I ever saw him again. During his sickness he made his will, giving me everything he had, with the proviso that not one sou was ever to go to enrich the man who had so deceived and abused me. And thus my mother and I were shielded in the future from the pangs of poverty and want which we had suffered in the past. But my home, where I had once been so happy as a free-hearted, innocent girl, had become hateful to me. Although a lawful wife, yet I could never be honored as such, situated as I was. My child would grow up to be wounded and taunted with never having known a father's love and care, and I determined to leave the place forever, and tell no one whither I was going. After considering the matter, my mother and I decided to leave France entirely and go to England, where no one would know us, and where we could live quietly, and with no fear of anyone ever reminding us of our troubles. We went to London, where I soon found a small villa in the extreme suburbs, which so pleased me that I hired it, and made for ourselves a quiet, pretty home. We lived there unmolested and contented for more than 2 years, when my mother was suddenly taken ill, and a long sickness followed. I gave her every care, and she finally began to mend. But I could see that her constitution was broken, and that she would never be the same woman that she had been. Still, I hoped to keep her with me for many years. We had made no acquaintances during our sojourn there, for I shrank from coming in contact with strangers. I was morbidly sensitive over the fact of having a husband and yet living separate from him, and I could not bear to subject myself to inquiries regarding the matter. I had resumed my maiden name, and everyone supposed that I was a son's wife. Though we made no friends, there were some few people living a mile or so from us in whom I became quite interested, and whose destitute condition I had noticed during some of my walks about the country. One of the children of a very poor family had been very sick while my mother was ill, and as soon as she was able to be left, I one day went to see them and ascertain what I could do to relieve their condition. I found them, as I expected, in great need, and very grateful for the basket of dainties which I took for the sick one, and for the money which I left with the woman. It was quite late in the afternoon when I had started on my errand, and by the time I was ready to return it was growing dusk. I feared I should not be able to reach home before dark, and in order to shorten the distance I determined to take the railway track. The frail girl paused a moment as she spoke of this, and her white face grew whiter still, while a horrible thrill seemed to pervade every one in that silent room as they realized what was to follow. "The railway," she began with a visible shudder, "curves very abruptly just at that point, but I took what I supposed was the track on which the outward-bound train ran, and deeming myself perfectly safe, since I thought I was sure to see a train if one should come, I walked slowly toward home, and unconsciously fell to musing. I do not know exactly when I began to be conscious of my danger. I heard a whistle behind me, but I was so sure I was upon the right track that I did not pay much heed to it. I glanced up, but there was no train ahead of me, so I walked leisurely on. Then those short, sharp whistles, those dreadful warning sounds, seemed to come from just behind me, and thrilled me to my soul with a terrible fear. I turned. The train was almost upon me. My blood suddenly froze in my veins. I seemed to become paralyzed and deprived of the power to move. On and on that fearful engine thundered. I thought of my child, of my mother. I shrieked a prayer to God for mercy, and then I was conscious of nothing that followed. Alice was shivering now with the terrible remembrance. Her teeth chattered, her lips were blue, her eyes had grown wild and staring, and poor little affrighted Amy clung to her in terror. "This will not do," muttered Dr. Murdoch with a gloomy brow, and springing to his feet he suddenly left the room. He was gone but a moment, however, and returned with a glass of something in his hand. He went to Alice's side and held it to her lips. "Drink it all, May," he whispered, unconsciously using the name by which he had always addressed her. She obeyed him mechanically, and then lay back, weak and exhausted. The recollection of those sad events had been almost too much for her frail strength. "Come and rest. You are not strong enough for all this excitement," the young doctor urged, with an anxious glance into her pallid face. She looked up at him sadly and shook her head. "I must settle with him first," she said, with a motion of her head toward her husband. The color mounted quickly to George Murdoch's face, and he turned abruptly from her and walked back to his corner. "What a fearful experience has been yours!" exclaimed Sir Harold with a sympathizing look. "But whatever prevented you from being crushed to death?" "I do not know. I expected to be hurled instantly into eternity. And indeed life has been a blank to me for more than a year, for I have known nothing since, until within the last week," she replied weakly. "It is the greatest mystery in the world," said Richard. "I cannot understand how she has been preserved. The engineer said he saw her immediately upon rounding the curve, and instantly reversed the engine and gave the signal for danger ahead. He used every effort to stop the train, and most of it was spent before it reached her. Some thought she was caught upon the cow-catcher and thrown clear from the track, or she would have been crushed. Everybody thought that life was extinct. Indeed, a physician said that she was dead, although no outward injuries that appeared very serious could be discovered. While the crowd was standing about her and speculating as to who she could be, I pushed by several people in order to get a nearer view, and as I did so, someone just in front of me uttered that cry of which I have already spoken. In an instant I looked up and saw who it was who had spoken those words. Others heard them also, but no one else appeared to know whence they came, although the conductor made inquiries hoping to discover who the unfortunate one was. But he never made another sign. But I, watching him as he went back to his seat in the carriage, saw him totter and grope his way like a drunken man. I determined to watch him. He had evidently made some strange and startling discovery, and a wild hope came to me that there might be some secret in his life that would prove he had no legal claim upon Miss Radcliffe. Since his treachery toward me, I was willing to believe almost anything of him. As I have already told him, I followed him to his hotel, kept watch of his movements there, and tracked him the next day to the morgue. I heard the eager questions which he put to the official in charge, and I shall never forget the look on his face when he was told that the body had been claimed and taken away. I also made inquiries after he had gone, hoping to discover who the girl was. But the man said that he knew nothing. A young gentleman, the woman's husband in all probability, had come early that morning and removed the body. I kept watch of Addison Cheetham for a while, hoping to gain some clue to the mystery of his strange emotion, but did not succeed and finally gave up the chase. I have often thought of that sad accident, and wondered who the poor unfortunate one could have been, but never learned until this hour. "Who saved her? Who took her from that place where they took her?" Sir Harold asked, glancing around the room. "I, sir. I would rather my patient had not been harassed with all these sad details in her present weak state," George Murdoch said, rising and turning his set, gloomy face toward his questioner. "But undoubtedly she would have learned them some time, and perhaps it will be just as well to canvass the whole matter once for all."
He then went on to tell the baronet the same story that he had already told Pearle. Everyone was intensely interested, and when he had concluded, Sir Harold went to him and took him warmly by the hand. "You deserve great credit, and you have my warmest gratitude for your prompt action in this matter," he said, heartily adding, "and as for your tender care of the poor stranger during all the long months of her unconsciousness, I have no words adequate to express my appreciation and admiration for both yourself and your mother. You have performed a deed over which angels might well rejoice. God bless you, my young friend, and you also, my dear madam." And Sir Harold's fine eyes were full of tears as he shook them both by the hand. Pearle's experience with Madame Renaud and little Amy were now rehearsed, that he and Richard might understand all the links in this strange story. She told him also of her engagement with Lady Fennelsey, her encounter with Addison Cheetham while she was among the hills of Scotland, and of Lord Fennelsey's brave defence. She related how he had followed her hither, and enlisted her ladyship's influence against her, and how she had indignantly dismissed her from her service, refusing her the protection she had craved until she could communicate with her friends, and thus she had been driven to seek shelter and security with Dr. Murdoch and his mother. And thus the whole story was made plain to everybody at last. When Alice understood all that Pearle had suffered from the persecution of the man whom she was forced to acknowledge as her husband, she was deeply moved. She arose from her chair when she had concluded her recital, and going to Pearle's side, she bent down, put both arms around her, and kissed her with trembling lips. "How glad I am for you that you are free from him," she whispered. "How much you must have suffered, and how nearly he succeeded in ruining your life, as he has ruined mine. And to think that through it all you have been the guardian of his child." "But, Alice dear, I did not know that Amy was his child, so there is no merit in my having cared for her, at least not in the way you mean," Pearle answered, returning her caress. "No, you did not know it, and I am glad you did not, for both your sake and hers, but you know it now. I hope it will not change your feelings toward either her or me," Alice said, with a wistful look into Pearle's fair face. "Dear child," Pearle answered with a tremulous smile, while with her well hand she drew Alice's head down to her shoulder, "do not allow such a thought ever to trouble you. Amy is as dear to me at this moment as she has ever been, and I have begun to look upon you almost as a dear sister. Because you happen to be connected with him cannot in any way affect my regard for you. How you comfort me! And yet I have a sort of guilty feeling, for if I had not left him, if I had borne all and asserted my position as his wife, if I had not hidden myself from everybody, all this trouble and suffering would never have come to you," Alice replied sadly. "Never mind that now, dear. God has taken care of me through it all. Indeed, through my trouble he has led me to trust him, and Alice, I feel that I am better prepared for the life that is before me for having passed through these deep waters." Sir Harold had approached Addison Cheetham while these two fair women were conversing thus. The wretch had sat silent and moody and listening to the strange stories that were being related in no enviable frame of mind. The man had sinned deeply, and he had also suffered deeply. He had fully believed that Alice Renaud was dead. When she had left him, driven from him by his abuse and neglect, he had gone home to his own estate, where he remained in ignorance of all concerning her, and glad, if the truth were known, to be rid of his beggar wife, as he had more than once called her after learning of her poverty. He had remained there, I say, in ignorance of all concerning her, until chance threw in his way a newspaper containing, as he supposed, the notice of her death. To say that he was glad but faintly expresses his feelings. He was exultant, for now he was free, and he could woo and win a rich bride, and he was very sure he would not be fooled a second time. That notice was the little slip of paper that he had taken from his wallet and read, after his first advances to Pearle in the grove on the day of the picnic. It was also the same slip that he had read in his room at the Langham Hotel, but he read it under very different circumstances then, for had he not only a few hours before looked upon the dead face of his wife? It was a terrible shock to him when he saw her lying there so white and still. He knew her at a glance, and those words. My God, how came she here?" were wrung from him with an agony such as he had never experienced in his life before. In an instant it flashed upon him that Pearle was not his wife, that marriage had been no marriage, and that she was free to wed Richard Bernholm if she chose. The fact that his wife was really dead at last made no difference. She had died more than a week too late. And then he began to wonder how that notice had come to be inserted in the paper. The only way in which he could account for it was that Alice, wishing him to believe her dead, had caused it to be inserted so that he would never seek or trouble her. Then he wondered how she came to be in England, if her father and her mother and her child were with her, and if so, where were they living? It was a very wretched night that he spent at the Langham, and before morning he had almost reasoned himself into the belief or hope that the dead woman was not his wife after all. But to make sure he had gone to the morgue, hoping to look once more upon that fearfully familiar face. But when told that a young man had taken the body he was more perplexed than ever, and no one can describe the fear and horror that possessed him as he returned to his room. Once there he grew desperate again, and he swore within himself that he would never relinquish his hold upon Pearle Radcliffe. He would not be baffled thus. No one knew that he had been married. No one should ever know it. His wife was really dead now. There could be no disputing it, for hundreds who had looked upon her said that she was dead. No one would ever know, even if it should ever be discovered that she had been his wife. But what she had really died, as that notice stated, and he resolved that he would continue his pursuit of Pearle and claim her as his wife in the face of all. Richard Bernholm should never triumph over him while he had life to thwart him. And so he relentlessly continued his search for her. The first time that he had seen his child that day by the roadside, he had been struck with her exceeding beauty, but he had not dreamed of the tie existing between them. The next time he saw her in that little arbour on the mountain in Scotland and heard her name, Amy, something in the sound and in those great blue eyes fixed in terror on him, transfixed him. Those eyes were very like Alice's in expression when he had been wont to abuse her. When Pearle had told him her mother was dead and she had adopted her, something of the truth dawned upon his mind, and that was why he was so eager to have her take the child and come with him. The idea had grown the more he thought about it, and when he came to France in search of Pearle, he had been almost as eager to gain possession of his child, as he hoped Amy would prove to be, as he was of Pearle. The night of the fire he had almost gloried in the danger that surrounded her. "I shall save her, and then she will owe me her life," he had said exultingly, as he bounded up the ladder to her rescue. End of chapters 45 and 46. Chapters 47 and 48 of Lost, a Pearle by Georgie Sheldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 47. A fearful retribution. But his heart sank like lead in his bosom when she told him that she would not leave the place until both her companions were safe. He feared he could not save them all. There was hardly a human being living who was strong enough to scale that dizzy height 3 times and bear away such a burden each time. But he swore he would do it, for no other must save the woman he loved. To him alone she must owe her life, and then she would not dare deny him the reward he should demand. He had accomplished the feat. He had been a hero in the eyes of everyone who saw him perform the act, but how different was the result from what he had hoped. Instead of glory and honor for the deed, he was now sitting there, crushed and humiliated, before the 2 women whom he had wronged, and the foe whom he hated. It was not a comfortable or pleasant position to be in, to say the least. Pearle never had looked so lovely to him before, despite the lines of suffering which were still visible in her face. She had never been more eagerly coveted. But his long-suffering wife had, as it were, suddenly risen from the dead to confront and denounce him. His child, too, with her clear, grave eyes, from which there looked forth such unconscious rebuke, seemed to condemn him, and a strange thrill pierced his heart as he remembered how she always instinctively shrank from him, as if with her childish intuition she had divined his natural baseness and treachery. She would never love him now, nor look up to him with a child's affection and respect. His wife, beautiful almost as Pearle, and very rich now, despised him. He read it in the cold, hard tones of her voice, in the curl of her delicate lips, in her averted glance, and he could never hope to reap any comfort or benefit through her. Richard Burnholm, once his strong, true friend, so loathed him that he did not deem him even worthy a thought of revenge. He had turned his back upon him, resolved to ignore utterly one who had fallen so low, and there was not a person in that room who did not regard him as a pariah among men. Surely his humiliation was complete. No foe could be more utterly conquered, and Pearle was amply avenged. When Sir Harold Cheswick approached Addison Cheetham, he looked up with a sullen, half-defiant air. "Are you satisfied now that your claim upon Miss Radcliffe is null and void?" the baronet asked sternly. "It appears to be a self-evident fact," he answered with sarcastic bitterness. "Then I trust you will see the wisdom of discontinuing your persecutions. Miss Radcliffe will return to her home at Ashton Manor, and it is safe to assume that neither she nor Captain Burnholm ever desire to meet you again." Addison Cheetham glanced over to where Pearle sat, one hand clasped in her lover's, who was bending fondly over her, while her now radiant face was raised trustfully to his. He clenched his hands, and his face grew almost purple, for the sight maddened him. He swore savagely under his breath, and then said aloud with a malignant scowl, "It is well for his future that I did not know all these facts before the fire." "What difference would it have made?" demanded Sir Harold. "This difference, that Richard Burnholm would have had but a mass of charred bones for his bride," he whispered hoarsely. Sir Harold shuddered at the malicious words. "Was it you who saved her?" he asked. "Yes, I saved her. I saved her. I would have died for her, for even one kind word or look from her," he cried wildly. "What is this?" Richard asked, coming quickly forward, while Pearle uttered a startled cry. "It was he who saved Miss Radcliffe from her peril the other night," Sir Harold explained, indicating Addison Cheetham. "Do I owe my life to him?" Pearle breathed, with a frightened look into the face of the man who had so wronged her. "Yes, to me. Are you not glad of the boon? Do you regret it coming from such a source?" Addison Cheetham asked bitterly. She sank back in her chair with a slight shiver. She was very glad of her life. Once more it looked very bright to her. But she would rather that the obligation rested anywhere else. But the man who had risked so much to save her ought at least receive her gratitude. Could she be grateful to him? Could she forgive him for all the misery he had caused her? Richard's face was fearfully pale as he considered that all his future joy he must owe to his enemy. He stood with downcast eyes and sternly compressed lips, with something of the same feelings which Pearle experienced battling in his heart. When at length he looked up, his glance fell sadly and regretfully upon the man who had betrayed him. "Addison," he said, and his voice was tremulous with emotion, "you were once my friend, and I loved and honored you as such. You betrayed me, and I had come to feel that I almost hated you. But if it was you who saved those 3 girls, you have accomplished a truly noble deed. You jeopardized your own life to save them, and surely I must believe that there is some good in you after all. You have saved her. She must have perished but for you, and I am grateful to you. Shall we say that this heroic act cancels the past? I hold out an olive branch to you. Shall we part at peace with one another?" It was a grand nature that could thus rise above the mighty injuries of the past, that could, as he said, thus hold out an olive branch to one who had been so deadly an enemy. They could never be friends again. They must never meet again. But Richard at least would not send him forth with the weight of his hatred resting upon him, to follow and pursue him wherever he went. It was a hard thing to do, even knowing that to him he owed Pearle's life and all the happiness that was to be his, through her, in the future. But afterward he always remembered with thankfulness this effort that he made to forgive him, as we are commanded to forgive those who injure us. It melted Pearle, who for the moment had felt as if it was more than even she could do, and she murmured brokenly, "I also forgive the past.
May one greater than I forgive you too."
It was a Christian woman's forgiveness and prayer, a prayer equal to that of the martyr of old. "Lord, lay not this sin to their charge." Once she could not have uttered such pardoning words. Once her soul would have rebelled against any leniency toward one who had blighted her life as this man had done, and no vengeance would have been too swift or terrible to be hurled upon him for his offense. But the current of her life had changed. Willfulness, pride, and selfishness had given place to gentleness, peace, and goodness. And her fair, bright future would be molded after a divine pattern that would diffuse beauty and joy wherever she went. Addison Cheetham sprang to his feet at the words she uttered, as if goaded to madness, and confronted Richard, his face crimson, his eyes blazing hatred and defiance, his hands clenched and raised as if to strike him to the earth. "Part at peace with one another?" he cried fiercely. "You prefer pardon to me? Do you think that after being baffled at every turn, after staking what I have staked and lost, that I am going to fawn and cringe at your feet like a whipped cur? Do you prate to me of pardon, peace? I could grind you to powder beneath my heel and mock at your agony. I could hurl you into "Enough!" cried Sir Harold, and interrupting him with a gesture of command. "Do not stain your soul more deeply than it is already stained. Richard, do not cast your pearls before swine. He is utterly devoid of manhood. Let him alone. Let him drop out of your life from this time forth. Go your way and forget him if you can. As for you, sir," he went on, turning again to Addison Cheetham, "I would that you could draw some comfort from the fact of having performed one worthy act during your life, but I see that you cannot. And the deed as performed by you became an unworthy one, since it was actuated only by the grossest selfishness. Have you no conscience? Are you literally without a heart? Have you no compunction for your sins? Have you no regret for the wrong you have done that fair woman who is your wife?" "I have not wronged her. It is she who has wronged me," he answered, lifting his head defiantly and confronting the baronet, as Richard turned sadly away and went back to Pearle. "You reason strangely," Sir Harold said with quiet scorn. "Not so. I honestly believed her to be dead. I never should have dared to seek to win another had I known her to be living. In that I have not wronged her." "No," answered his companion, his handsome lips curling scornfully. "But you are guilty of even a greater wrong than that, even had it been intentional. You won her love, you made her desert her parents, leave her home, made her sacrifice everything that was dear to her in the world, and gave her nothing in return. You did all this to gratify your selfish greed, that you might possess the gold which you imagined her father held in his keeping. Look at the wreck which your greed has wrought. Have you no sorrow for it? Is there no regret in your heart that would prompt you to seek her forgiveness and urge you to make restitution, if such a thing could be possible?"
"There can be no restitution," Alice said in low, cold tones.
She had quietly approached during their conversation, and now spoke as one whose mind was made up as to the course she would pursue.
"There can be no restitution," she repeated. "He cannot restore to me the love and confidence which I once had for and in him. He cannot restore my happy home, happy even though so humble. He cannot restore my father, nor the pride and joy he once experienced in his only child, nor yet the respect and esteem of those with whom I used to mingle. I have nothing left of all that I once held so dear. I have nothing in the world remaining to comfort me save my little child. She is the only link I have left to bind me to life. For her I must live and strive to make the future as bright as may be, and my aim will be so to rear her that her life may not be ruined by a mistake which proved so fatal to her mother." "Then you have no desire to return to your husband? You cannot forgive the past, Alice?" Sir Harold asked. He had been wondering how these two would settle matters. She made an involuntary gesture of repulsion. "He does not desire my forgiveness. I know him but too well. There is not one regret in his heart for all the wrong he has done me, no love for me, no sorrow for what I have suffered. I am rich, since Uncle Alec's bequest to me. Had he known of that, and that I was living, he might have returned to me, and tried by smooth words to make me believe that he regretted the past, in order that he might have become possessed of my gold. Now you tell me that I am to be richer still, and there may be a feeling of disappointment that he cannot have the benefit of my fortune. He might be willing to tolerate me for the sake of such gain. Do you think, knowing all this, that I have any forgiveness to offer?" she asked, in tones so cold and indifferent that Sir Harold knew that as far as any regard for her husband was concerned, she was indeed dead to him forever. And yet he sighed heavily as he looked upon her. She was very fair and lovely. She looked gentle and tender in spite of the hard, passionless words she had just uttered. She could have made some good man's home a little paradise on earth, and she seemed like one who could have enjoyed to their utmost the blessings and pleasures of a fond husband, a happy home, and bright children. She heard his sigh, and it seemed to breathe something like reproach for her hardness, for looking up a troubled expression came into her eyes as she continued wearily, "I wish him no ill. I have no spirit of revenge, and I would do him no wrong, even in thought. But I know his selfish nature so well that I would not trust my future, nor that of my child's, for a single day in his keeping. I would not forfeit my self-respect by pretending a regard and confidence that I do not feel. I wish to drop out of his life as completely as if I were really dead, as he believed me to be." Her coldness and indifference seemed to sting the man of whom she was speaking with a keenness which he had never before experienced. There was something far more attractive about this calm, self-sustained woman with her pure, pale face and great dark eyes, than there had been about the gay and happy Alice Renaud. There was a quiet dignity about her that impressed him, and the thought had come to him, while sitting there, that, with the great wealth that had fallen to her, she would make a lovely mistress at Pelham Pines. Pearle he could not have now. Why not make peace with Alice, and gather what good he could from the inevitable? How well she had read his nature to Sir Harold, and with what indifference she had repudiated his every claim upon her. It stung him keenly. "You would not trust your own nor your child's future for a single day with me? How would it seem if I should take that child from you?" "Remember that she is mine as well as yours," he said savagely through his set teeth. Alice caught her breath quickly at his words, but she replied firmly, "You can never take my child from me. No court would ever give her to you when once I had told my story. I have not forgotten, nor have you." And here her gentle black eyes blazed with a fire which Sir Harold had not thought her capable of exhibiting, while she faced her husband with a boldness that made him wince. "How once, when I refused to obey one of your brutal behests, and you could not move me by either threats or blows, you revenged yourself upon me by seizing my baby from her crib, and abusing her so that she carried the marks upon her tender flesh for a month." And the outraged mother shivered at the remembrance of the deed. "Perhaps, Mrs. Cheetham, you might desire a divorce," he sneered, though he was very pale with anger. "A divorce would not make me more free than I shall be without it," she said coldly. "It might, perhaps, give you the opportunity to marry your soft-hearted doctor, and in that way repay him for his care in the past for his pretty fool." The words were fearfully malicious, but Addison Cheetham had not been unobservant of George Murdoch's manner toward his wife, and he had drawn his own conclusions therefrom. Sir Harold opened his lips to denounce the villain, but Alice proudly interrupted, though a vivid colour flamed her cheeks. "I owe Dr. Murdoch a debt of gratitude which I can never repay. And," she added with a curl of her sweet lips and a look that cowed him, "he is a man who in every way commands my respect. Now, Sir Harold," she continued, turning to the baronet, "I have done with this remnant of my old life forever, and you are the only one in all the world who is in the remotest degree connected with me. I have no real claim upon you, and yet something in your face tells me that I may come to you in my need. You say that you hold a fortune in trust for me. Will you not take me and my child into your care also? Will you be my protector, my adviser? I am so alone. The world seems such a large, such an empty place to me in my friendlessness. May I rely on you,
Who could resist the sweet pleader with her tremulous lips, her pathetic tones, and tearful eyes? Surely not the noble, tender-hearted baronet. "Yes, my dear child," he said, deeply moved by her petition, "and I am glad to assume the care. The world is almost an empty place to me also, and from this moment I adopt you as my daughter. Your little one will be like a sunbeam in my lonely house, and I will be a faithful guardian to you both. And now," he concluded, turning again to Addison Cheetham, "since this matter has been settled, it is best that this interview should end. But, young man, for your own peace of mind, let me urge you to lead a different life in the years to come from what you have in the past. Remember that a future must come when you will be obliged once more to meet all those whom you have injured. I pray that day will find us, everyone, ready to meet the Judge of all the earth." He took Alice by the hand as he ceased speaking, and led her across the room to Pearle, while Addison Cheetham, 100 conflicting emotions raging in his heart, staggered from the apartment. Dr. Murdoch was startled by a strange look that came over his face as he went out and shut the door, and sprang up as if to follow him. Then, as if suddenly changing his mind, he sank back upon his chair, while his eyes wandered wistfully, yet gloomily, toward the slight figure in white now kneeling by Pearl's chair, with Amy's arms clasping her neck. The next moment everyone in that room was electrified by the sound of a heavy fall accompanied by a wild cry, and then there came an ominous and dreadful silence. They sprang into the hall to ascertain what had happened. A thrill of horror pierced each heart and blanched each face as they bent over the stair railing and looked below. Addison Cheetham lay there a senseless, motionless heap. Blinded by passion, every nerve tingling with the fury that was raging within him over his ignominious defeat, he had taken no heed to his steps and so rushed recklessly on to his destruction. A maid had been sweeping the upper hall, but being called away from her work for a few moments, had carelessly left her dustpan and brush upon the upper stair, and her broom leaning against the wall. Addison Cheetham saw the broom. It angered him to see it there, and with an oath and a kick he sent it flying on before him. The dustpan and brush he did not see, and stepped heedlessly down upon the ladder. It crushed beneath his weight, and threw him with dreadful force from the top to the bottom of the stairs. He was taken up insensible and borne to his room, where Dr. Murdoch made an examination of his injuries. One leg was broken in 2 places, and 3 ribs upon his right side crushed in upon his lungs. There was a terrible bruise just over one of his temples, and his skull was fractured. What an immediate and fearful retribution had overtaken the wretched man! "There is no help for him. He cannot live 12 hours, Dr. Murdoch said, with a face almost as ghastly as that of his unconscious patient. He had been thinking while making his examination, "Am I in any way responsible for this? If I had followed him and spoken to him, as I thought of doing, could I have saved him from his fearful doom?" Alice Renaud, with a wild horror in her eyes, had followed them to her husband's room, and when the young physician uttered those fatal words, she at once took her place by his bedside. With trembling fingers, she wet a napkin and laid it over that unsightly bruise, and with another began wiping the blood from his face. Dr. Murdoch exclaimed at the act, and anxiously scanning her beautiful face, came to her side and caught both her hands in his. "You must not stay here," he said authoritatively, but with trembling lips. "Oh, yes, I must," she answered calmly, but with a weary glance at the distorted face upon the pillow. "He is helpless and suffering, and I am willing to do what I can for him. I do not wish him any ill. I really wish he might have been spared to be a better man. Are you sure you can do nothing to restore him?" "Nothing. No power on earth can ever restore him," he said solemnly. She sighed, while her eyes seemed fixed in a sort of fascinating horror upon that deathly countenance. "May, look at me," George Murdoch said sternly, and her glance was lifted obediently to him. "Do you value your recovered reason? Do you wish to save yourself for the sake of your child? If so, you must leave this room at once. You can be of no earthly service here. I will do everything that can be done for him. If I could save his life, God knows I would do it, but I cannot,
I will not let you stay." Without releasing her hands, without even waiting for her to reply, he led her to Sir Harold, and bade him take her away. She made no objection, but with one last backward glance at that face fast settling into the rigidity of death, she allowed Sir Harold to lead her from the place, and had looked her last upon the man whom once she had believed she fondly loved, and awoke when it was too late to a knowledge of her error. Addison Cheetham died that night. In the silence and dreariness of the midnight hour he breathed his last, and the hand of the man he had so deeply injured, whose confidence he had betrayed, whose trust he had abused, closed his eyes in their last long sleep. "I am glad I did not withhold my pardon," he said, with a feeling of comfort that the last words which he had spoken to the man who had once been his friend had been kind words, that he had not parted angrily with him. He was gone, he could never injure him more, and there was much of sadness in his heart for a life that had been so misused, and nothing of bitterness for the treachery that had so nearly ruined him. Sir Harold, with Dr. Murdoch and Richard, attended to all that was necessary, and accompanied the mangled body to its home at Pelham Pines, where, after it had been laid to rest beside its kindred, they remained for a day or two to consult with the agent regarding the disposal of the property. There was no will, and Sir Harold, who considered himself the guardian of little Amy, who of course would inherit her father's property, assumed the control of everything, and then all returned to their friends at Vannes. 48. Forgiveness brings peace. The day following the departure of Sir Harold and his companion upon their sad errand, Pearle and Alice were sitting in the room of the former, conversing gravely upon the strange events which had so recently occurred. Both had been shocked and saddened by the horrible accident which had so suddenly hurled into eternity the author of so much of their trouble and sorrow. But they could not mourn for one in whom there did not appear to be one lovable quality. Even the young wife herself could not experience much of grief at her bereavement, if such it could be called. Her love for the man, if indeed she had ever really borne him any real love, had died a violent death years before, and while she never would have dared to wish that he might be removed from her path in any such tragic way, yet she knew that she never wanted to look upon his face again. She was glad to be free. While they were talking of these things, a servant entered the room and handed Pearle a note. Opening it, she read in Lady Fennelcy's handwriting: "Miss Radcliffe, if I have not offended you beyond all forgiveness, will you kindly grant me an interview? Yours in mingled sorrow and gratitude, Ursula Fennelcy." Pearle's fair face flushed crimson as she read these strangely humble words from the haughty woman, and then she passed the note to Alice, and turned to look for her pencil to answer it. It is not to be expected that she could forget Lady Fennelcy's overbearing and unkind treatment of her, nor her haughty supercilious manner toward her during all the time she had been a member of her family. She could not forget her sneers and sarcasms, her heartless refusal to protect her from the persecutions of the man she so feared, nor the unfeeling way in which she had dismissed her from her service, thus leaving her alone and utterly friendless in that strange place. But she was not one to shrink from duty. She had not shrunk from the terrible ordeal which had so nearly cost her her life, when she had voluntarily chosen to sacrifice herself in order that the worldly woman's daughters might be spared to her, and now she would not withhold from her the comfort of her forgiveness for the past if she desired it. She had stood too near death, and realized too vividly that life is not given to man for the purpose of considering alone his own selfish feelings and inclinations, to waste any portion of what remained in harboring resentment, or a desire to avenge his individual wrongs. Yes, she could forgive Lady Fennelcy. She could, in her gratitude for the great happiness and blessedness that had been so wonderfully restored to her, even forgive the haughty and disagreeable Camilla for her unparalleled insults and abuse. "Dear Lady Fennelcy," she wrote, "I shall be very glad to see you, and trust that you will come at your earliest convenience, as I am not yet able to leave my room. Very respectfully, Margaret Radcliffe." There was the least gleam of pride in the smile that curved Pearle's lips as she thus signed her own name for the first time for over a year. She gloried in it as she had never done before. "I never thought I could love it so well," she said to herself as she sat thoughtfully contemplating it after she had written it.
Then it gave her such a sense of freedom to write it, making her realize so fully that those hateful shackles which had been so galling to her had dropped from her forever. She no longer need to hide like a fugitive and an outcast. She no longer need to reproach her weak, fond heart, vainly striving to drive out, to crush and trample upon the love that would not die. Oh, it was a blessed freedom, a blissful release after the long and weary bondage she had endured. For the first time in her life, Lady Fennelsey had been brought to see herself as she was. On that dreadful night when she had stood safe upon the ground, and watched in despair the perilous situation of her daughters, believing that they were surely doomed to a horrible death; when she had seen that noble girl whom she had treated so ill, firmly reject every offer of escape, putting back the hand that had been outstretched to save her, and giving calm and thoughtful directions for the salvation of her children, she had come suddenly to realize her own littleness of soul, the wickedness of her pride, and the cruelty of her nature. And when it was all over and Pearle was actually saved, and for the first time she was told who her gentle governess was, the daughter of a proud old house, the sister of an earl, a wealthy heiress, and a cultivated, refined lady whose station was even above her own, she was humbled to the dust. It was true that Addison Cheetham had told her name, and that she belonged to a good family, and she had thought that possibly she might be some poor distant connection of the Earl of Ratcliffe. But she had reasoned that the relationship must be very distant, since she in her pride could conceive of no lady of station being driven by any necessity into voluntary exile from family, friends, and wealth, and made willing to accept so humble a position as that of governess. "Why didn't she tell me that she was Margaret Ratcliffe and sister to the Earl?" she groaned with a blush of shame, while talking the matter over with her daughters. "I would have sympathized with her in her trouble, and shielded her from that man." "She would tell you, mamma, that the fact of her being Miss Ratcliffe of Ashton Manor, and an heiress, ought not to gauge in any degree the principle of kindness which should actuate anyone. She would tell you that every governess should be as considerately treated as if she was born to the highest position in the land," answered Franchita, who had always admired Pearle exceedingly and laid her precepts to heart. "Really, Franchita, I hope you do not mean mamma to infer that she ought to set her governess in the drawing-room and treat her like a duchess," exclaimed Camilla, who, although much subdued and thoroughly ashamed of her treatment of Pearle, was not prepared to adopt quite such radical ideas as these. "Of course a governess cannot be a duchess, neither is a scullery maid fitted for the position of a governess. Some are born to serve in the world, and others to be served. But as far as heart and feelings are concerned, one is entitled to just as much consideration as the other. I don't believe that because you and I were born the children of a lord, our feelings are any finer or tenderer than those of anyone who may be employed to serve us. Of course a servant must be made to know and keep his or her place, but no one, according to my ideas, has a right to vent his or her spleen or ill will upon another who happens to occupy a humbler position in life," argued Franchita earnestly. "Franchita is right," said her mother gravely, "and I am glad to hear you express yourself so freely. I have been taught a lesson which I trust I shall never forget. Miss Ratcliffe has been a lady in every sense of the word during her residence in our family, and as such was entitled to respect and consideration without regard to her birth. I have been overbearing and in many instances unkind to her. Prosperity and pride have made me hard, unfeeling, and selfish," Lady Fennelsey concluded humbly. She went to Pearle in this frame of mind, and the gentle girl saw at once that she was sincere. "You dear self-sacrificing child," she said, weeping uncontrollably as she saw her bandaged hand and feet. "Can you forgive me for the past, and what can I say to prove to you how I honor and bless you? But for your presence of mind, your firmness and decision, and your self-abnegation, one at least of my children would have been burned to death. I have no words to express my gratitude. There are no words strong enough." "You do not need to do or say anything, Lady Fennelsey," Pearle interposed gently as she paused. "I know that you are grateful, and I am as thankful as you can be that both Miss Fennelsey and Franchita are safe.
If I had been rescued and they had perished, I think I never could have known another peaceful moment during all my life." "Did you expect to be saved?" Lady Fennelsey asked, regarding her earnestly. "No, I did not," Pearle replied, growing very white at the remembrance of how she had made up her mind to die. "I did not believe there would be time for the man who saved us to go down twice with his burden and come back for me, and I did not believe that his strength would hold out, or that the ladder would sustain him, for it was burning nearly all the time." "I know," her ladyship said with a shudder. "But, Miss Radcliffe, did you feel no temptation to leave Camilla behind and save yourself? She has treated you very ill." She asked it hesitatingly, wonderingly, for she could not even now quite understand the spirit that had prompted her heroism. Pearle turned to her, a look of surprise in her deep grey eyes, and the slightest possible accent of scorn rang in her tones as she replied, "Leave a fainting, helpless girl to perish miserably in those flames? Lady Fennelsey, I could not have done it. She was a human being. Her life was just as precious as mine. She had no power to help herself. Oh, it would have been cowardly, shameful, and I never once thought of the past. Miss Radcliffe, you are infinitely greater than I, and I have dared to set myself up above you. Will you forgive me for my unkindness in the past?" her ladyship asked in trembling tones, and regarding the beautiful girl almost reverently. "Most freely," Pearle answered, deeply moved. "I do not deserve it, but you have taught me a lesson that I shall never forget. You have taught me that, in one sense, every woman is my sister, and every man my brother. I trust that the lesson may make me very kind to every one who may serve me in the future," Lady Fennelsey said humbly. "I am glad to hear you say that," Pearle returned with a bright look. "For I think that no lady should ever forget that her servants and dependents have just as tender hearts as she herself has. But we will not dwell upon the unpleasant things of the past, for I have much that will be pleasant to remember, since I have become deeply attached to Franchita and the children, and I feel that I have also gained their affections in a measure." "Indeed you have, and it is very good of you to regard them so kindly. I do hope, Miss Radcliffe, that you may never know another sorrow as long as you live," said her ladyship earnestly, and wondering how she could have had this sweet spirit in her family for so long, and not learned to love her also. "Such a wish as that can hardly be fulfilled in this world, but I thank you for it nevertheless," the fair girl answered sweetly. "And," she continued with gentle gravity, "I hope we will all improve our opportunities, so that when the last hour does really come, as we feared it had to some of us the other night, we can meet it with the consciousness of leaving our work well done." Pearle then changed the subject and explained something of the trouble that she had been in during her absence from her home, and when she had finished she said kindly, "I hope, Lady Fennelsey, that you will allow Fred and Clara to come to Ashton Manor some day. I think they would enjoy it, for I have some nephews and nieces there who would try to make a visit pleasant for them." While she was speaking there had come a timid trembling knock upon the door, but neither Pearle nor her visitor heard it, and the latter answered, "It is very gracious of you, Miss Radcliffe, to invite them, and they shall go some time. Now, I have one more favour to ask of you. May Camilla come and see you before you go away?" Lady Fennelsey put this question with some hesitation, for she knew but too well how deeply her eldest daughter had offended, but she longed to have them at peace. The words were scarcely uttered when Camilla herself entered the room. She had followed her mother hither, and knocked twice for admittance, but no one had heeded her, and when at last she heard her ladyship ask if she might be allowed to come, she could not even wait to hear Pearle's reply. She went straight to her, knelt at her feet, and burying her face in her lap, burst into bitter weeping. "I could not wait," she sobbed. "I followed mamma here. And oh, Miss Radcliffe, I must tell you how you have broken my proud spirit, and I have come to beg that you will not utterly hate me all your life." "The world is not all bad," thought Pearle tearfully. "There is some good in every heart, if one can only get down to it."
She was taken wholly by surprise by this unexpected visit and the attitude of the weeping girl. She had never thought to see the haughty damsel in so humble a mood as this. She was so moved that she could not reply for a moment, but she lifted the bowed head, and, bending forward, gently kissed her on the forehead. "Let this blot out all unpleasantness between us, Miss Fennelsey," she said. "I have no ill feeling regarding anything that has transpired in the past, and we will never speak of it again." Camilla Fennelsey leaned back and looked in astonishment at the beautiful girl who could thus give her the kiss of peace. "I have behaved shamefully," she said, crimsoning to the roots of her hair, "and I never said such a thing in my life before to anyone. Will you forgive me?" Surely the mighty had fallen, the proud brought very low, if this high-spirited girl could sue thus humbly for pardon. "Freely," was the only word which Pearle could force her trembling lips to utter. "I believe you are almost an angel," Camilla said involuntarily. Then, her eyes falling upon Pearle's bandaged hand and arm, she exclaimed, shuddering, "Ah! This poor hand was burnt for me. Miss Radcliffe, if a year of my life would atone for what you must have suffered, I believe I would willingly give it to you." Pearle laid her fingers gently on the impulsive girl's lips. "The years of our life do not belong to us to give to anyone. They are days of grace lent us, and during which we are expected to meet our responsibilities. But," she added, speaking more lightly, "my hand, and indeed all my injuries, are improving rapidly, and Dr. Murdoch thinks that in time even the scars will disappear. At least from my hand, those upon my feet are deeper. Now tell me if you are fully recovered from the shock which you received." "No," Miss Fennelsey cried, starting up with a wild expression in her eyes, and clasping her hands almost convulsively. "I dream of that dreadful scene continually. I feel that horrible suffocating sensation, that scorching, wilting, blasting heat, that lurid, blind smoke. Oh, if I could only forget it! If I never need think of it again!" Pearle shivered. It came over her also like this at times, sickening her with the remembrance, making every nerve in her body tingle with horror, and leaving her faint and strengthless as an infant. But she could not bear to talk of it, and she saw that Camilla was utterly unnerved by the thought of it, so she began talking of something else, gradually winning their minds to more agreeable subjects, and they chatted pleasantly thus for nearly an hour. "We return to the Priory tomorrow," Lady Fennelsey said after a while. "Our nerves have been so unsettled, to say nothing of the loss of the greater part of our wardrobe, that I think we will all be better off at home for the present. Ambrose will meet us in Paris, and escort us from there. Please give my kind regards to your son, Lady Fennelsey. I owe him a debt of gratitude, for he once rendered me sufficient service, concerning which he will doubtless tell you himself," Pearle said with a smile, though a rich colour tinged her cheeks, as she remembered all that had occurred on that day. Lady Fennelsey coloured also. She had not forgotten her fears that her idolized son might fall in love with a despised governess, an event which she would have been only too proud to sanction now. But Sir Harold Cheswick had told her something of Miss Radcliffe's romantic history, and she knew that Captain Burnholm was to bear away the prize which so many had coveted. Pearle took leave of them in the kindest manner, and referred indirectly to her future prospects, by giving them a cordial invitation to visit her when she would be settled in a home of her own, which her ladyship considered very kind and gracious of her. In the afternoon, Franchita and the younger children paid her a visit, which she enjoyed exceedingly, and when night came and she laid her head upon her pillow, it was with a feeling of sweet satisfaction and thankfulness that she was at peace with all the world. Thus blessings ever wait on virtuous deeds, and though elate, a sure reward succeeds. End of chapters 47 and 48. Chapters 49 and 50 of Lost a Pearl by Georgie Sheldon. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 49. New-born hopes. Richard had written almost immediately to the Earl of Radcliffe that Pearle was found, and 2 days after the events related in the last chapter he had arrived at Vannes, and with inexpressible thankfulness clasped his only and dearly beloved sister to his heart once more. It was almost like receiving the dead back to life again, and strong man though he was, he bowed his head over her and wept tears of joy. "How those dear hands have toiled and suffered," he said, kissing them tenderly. "Pearle, oh Pearle, how could you hide yourself from us so?" he added reproachfully.
"Because I believed I must, that it was best. Because I was afraid of all manner of evil from him, if I remained where any of my friends could communicate with me. I was wild that day, Allstone. Oh, it was so hard, and it seemed almost as if I was accursed in the eyes of all the world and of heaven," Pearle sobbed, clinging to him convulsively. She had kept up bravely until now, but to be clasped once again in her idolized brother's protecting arms, and to realize, as she had never quite realized before, that all the wretchedness was past, was such a relief, and such a blessed assurance that all was well, that she yielded to the momentary weakness which overcame her, and wept unrestrainedly upon his breast, and confessed all the bitterness of the struggles through which she had passed. "I tried every way to find you, my darling," he said, tenderly stroking her shining head. "I advertised in all the papers." "Yes, I know," she interrupted, smiling through her tears. "I clipped one of those advertisements from a paper and have it now. But what a strange one it was. How happened you to word it in that way? Lost, a pearl?" "Because I knew that though it might be blind to all the world, yet you would understand it if you should see it. If you had but let me know where you were and what you were doing, I could have borne it better." "No, you could not, Allstone. You never would have rested, and you would not have allowed me to rest, and it would have been an additional strain upon my heart." "But I am so glad that it is all over at last," Pearle sighed gratefully. He kissed her lips fondly, saying, "Yes, dear, and now that I have you once more, I shall keep you and guard you very jealously." "Do not speak with too much assurance regarding property that is not wholly at your disposal," laughed a manly voice behind them, and looking they saw the handsome face of Richard Burnholm beaming upon them. "Ah, Richard! I suppose you will claim a share in the prize, since you found her. You declared you would, but I must confess I feared you would not succeed," replied the Earl. "I never would have relinquished the search," he answered with a determined expression. "But I have had a wild goose chase of it as it is, I can assure you. And now, having my bird once more in hand, I have no idea in relinquishing my hold until I have it properly tamed and caged," he concluded, laughing. "It will not take long to do that. The taming, I mean," replied the Earl. "But where did you get your clue to her whereabouts?" "Well, that is a long story, and I shall have to begin with my meeting with Sir Harold Cheswick," Richard answered, drawing a chair before them and sitting down. He then related how he had met the baronet, the accident which was the result of it, and the renewal of their friendship, and how he had learned that Miss Melford, who had been the companion of his child, was his Pearle. He told of their journey to Chalons, their effort to discover the relatives of Sir Harold's wife, their disappointment, their accidental meeting with his cousin Eugène at Bar-le-Duc, their visit to the little church, and the strange discovery they had there made. "It was wonderful," Richard said. "When I looked upon the names which Sir Harold had stumbled upon in the register, I could scarcely believe my eyesight. The knowledge that Addison Cheetham had actually been married before he ever saw Pearle, and that in all probability his wife was living, came like a thunderbolt to me. It stunned me. It took away all my strength, and then it made such a savage of me that for the time I craved his heart's blood. For if Alice Renault was living, and we had every reason to believe that she was, he had done 2 women a deadly wrong. Although I knew if we could find that wronged wife, we could prove that Pearle was and always had been free. My joy on that account was short-lived, however, for on going down to Pelham Pines and confronting him, and charging him with his crime, he was so cool and indifferent, so insufferably insolent, that he nearly drove me wild.
He committed himself to nothing, and though I had a strong hope that something could be proved against him in connection with that woman, whom every one believed to have been killed by the railway train, yet I went away quite discouraged. I can understand now why he was so cool and indifferent. He, too, believed her dead, and the matter shrouded in such mystery that no one would ever unravel it." He then went on to explain how they had met young Lord Fennelsey in London, and through him accidentally learned that Pearle was governess in his mother's family, and they had at once hastened to Vannes, where they had arrived the night of the fire. "What a strange, strange story!" the Earl exclaimed when he had learned all that had transpired during the months of Pearle's absence. "Yes, it is a romantic one, too, though with much of sadness and misery in it." "My darling, are you not glad that it is over?" Richard asked, getting possession of the little hand that lay idly in her lap. She heaved a little sigh. "Yes, I hope we have bidden a long farewell to the sadness and misery, but," looking up at him with shining eyes and flushing cheeks, "I don't think I quite like to say that this story is all told, all over. Wait until I shall write the sequel for you. You don't know what a race I may lead you yet." "Pearle, that is like your own bright self once more. How glad you make me!" he cried, bending eagerly toward her and reading the sweet face with the little smile of mischief dimpling it. "When shall we go back to Ashton Manor?" asked the Earl. "Tomorrow," Pearle answered eagerly. "And the wedding?" whispered Richard. "No, not tomorrow," she said with a saucy glance as she beckoned Alice, who had just entered the room, to come to her. 10 days had elapsed since the fire, and Pearle's burns were now so nearly healed that Dr. Murdoch thought it would be prudent for her to return to Ashton Manor, if she desired, and the day was set for, not tomorrow, but the day after. No one could know what it cost the young doctor to grant this permission, for he knew that when Pearle went Alice would go also, since she had been invited to go home and remain with her until Sir Harold's residence was ready to receive them. George Murdoch had never dreamed, during his ceaseless, tender care of the unfortunate girl, while in her state of imbecility, that he was growing to love her with all the strength of his great heart, and he probably never would have discovered it if she had remained in that helpless condition. He would have gone on tending her kindly and faithfully, devoting his life to her, without a thought that she could ever be anything nearer to him. But when the light of reason returned to her dark eyes, when her face began to brighten and glow with intelligence, and her manner to change from its helpless dependence to sweet and matronly dignity, tempered with something of reserve, his heart pulses began to quicken, and he suddenly awoke to a consciousness of his real feeling toward her. Then the knowledge that she was a wife and her wretched husband living came to blight every budding hope within his breast. She could be nothing to him, and he had loved in vain, and every day in her presence only served to torture him, by showing him how much dearer she was becoming to him. Then that dreadful accident occurred. Addison Cheetham was dead, and Alice free once more to wed whomsoever she would. But pride now stung him with its poison-pointed arrows. She was very rich, and he, a poor struggling doctor, would be deemed calculating and presuming if he should seek to win Sir Harold Cheswick's wealthy ward, and so he set a seal upon his heart and lips, and suffered in silence. Mrs. Murdoch saw all this, and it troubled her deeply. She too loved the beautiful woman who had been so gentle and patient during her helplessness, as she would have loved a daughter, and it would have comforted her greatly if her noble son could have won her for his wife. Did Alice herself mistrust this state of things? If the lovely colour which crept into her cheeks at the sound of George Murdoch's step or voice, if her shyly averted eyes when she found him regarding her with that mournful, wistful look, if the sudden trembling of her white hand whenever he laid his fingers upon her pulse, were indications that she suspected the great love for her that grew and throbbed in his heart, then signs were not wanting to testify to it. The morning came at last on which the party bound for Ashton Manor was to leave. The hour for parting drew near, and Alice sought her friends to say farewell. "Dear Mrs. Murdoch," she said, twining her arms around the good woman's neck and laying her lips against her cheek, "you have been like a dear mother to me, and I love you more than I can tell you.
Will you come and make me a long, long visit when I am settled in Sir Harold's home? It will not be far for you to come," she added, smiling, "for you will be in London also." "Yes, my dear, I will come, and I am glad that you will be so near us. But," she added, with a searching look into the fair face, "you will move in a very different circle from that which we frequent. You will have friends who are wealthy and fashionable and cultured to claim your time. But nothing can ever make those who have been so kind to me during my misfortune less dear to me. Dear Mrs. Murdoch, don't imagine that I am going to forget," Alice urged wistfully, half reproachfully. Mrs. Murdoch tearfully embraced her, and returned her fond caress with an unutterable longing in her heart. Alice then turned to the young physician, who had stood like some grim statue regarding this leave-taking, and but for the look of misery in his eyes, one could almost have believed him to have been petrified. She held out both her hands to him. He took them mechanically, and felt them tremble like two frightened birds in his clasp. "To you," she began in suppressed tones, "I owe a debt that I can never pay. But—" She could not go on. She lifted her tear-laden eyes to his face, and the look which she saw there broke her down completely. She bowed her head upon those strong hands clasping hers, those kind, tender hands that had done so much for her, and burst into passionate weeping. He shook like a reed at the act. May, I cannot bear this," he whispered, and grasping both her hands in one of his, he stretched forth his right arm and drew her to him for one brief instant, murmuring passionately, "God bless you. God ever bless you, and make your future bright and beautiful." He touched her forehead with his cold lips, and then released her, but the heart against which she had leaned for that one short moment was bounding with agony and rebellion at this parting. Did something tell her what he was suffering? Did she, too, regret this separation? Again she lifted her eyes to his. There was a strange light in them, half defiant, half yearning, and her face was crimson with blushes. "I should think you were bidding me good-bye forever. You are so solemn about it," she said with a pretty little pout, and an air, an indescribable something, that made his heart bound with a wild, sweet, sudden hope in his bosom. "But," she continued, wiping the tears from her cheeks, which grew redder every moment, "I want you to understand that it is to be for only a very little while. I have no idea of losing sight of my dearest friends." It was the slightest possible emphasis that she put upon the adjective, but it was an emphasis, and it is strange how the burden began to roll from his soul, how the gloom faded from his face, and a glad light came creeping into the eyes fixed so eagerly upon her expressive countenance. Was it possible that she was holding out a glimmer of hope to him? Had she read his secret, and, understanding the cause of his grief, taken this way to tell him that she was not indifferent to his love? Her blushes certainly looked like it, her shy, sweet glances, and the little petulant tone in which she had spoken, thrilled him and gave him courage to believe that when a proper time had elapsed he might speak and tell her how dear she was to him, and she would not turn coldly from him. "Mamma, the coach has come," and little Amy, charming in her pretty travelling suit, danced into the room just in time to break a pause that was becoming awkward to all parties. George Murdoch held out his arms to her, and she sprang into them and was hugged with a fervour that made his mother smile. He must relieve his full heart in some way, and he was thankful to the little sprite for having entered so opportunely, or he might have been betrayed into some unwise and premature expression of his feelings. He could not feel that it would be right to claim anything just now, remembering that man so lately laid in his grave, notwithstanding Alice's confession that she had neither love nor respect for her husband. He could wait. The new-born hope in his heart would keep for a while, and cheer him as he went back once more to his duties. They were all gone at last. Pearle, with Alice and Amy, Richard and her brother back to Ashton Manor, where they were all received with rejoicing. George Murdoch and his mother returned to his practice and their humble home in London, and Lady Fennelsey with her family to Dunbarton Priory. Thus the play at Vannes was played out, and all the actors had disappeared from the stage. How true it is that
All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts. 50. Pearle's happiness. All the world, all Pearle's world, rejoiced and made merry over the escape which their favorite had had from a life of trouble and misery, and looked forward with many hopes and wishes of joy to the time when she should go to reign in that beautiful home which had been prepared for her so long ago. Nothing had been disturbed at Linden Grange. The beautiful rooms had all been shut up, and the house had been desolate enough, for Richard could not endure to enter the place which he had prepared for his bride with so much of joy and hope, and which afterward had only seemed to mock him with its dreary loveliness. Now, however, the silent rooms were thrown open once more. The bright glad sunshine shone in at the windows, and danced merrily and invitingly over every beautiful thing that had been placed there by such loving hands, while Richard, his handsome face luminous from his recovered joy, superintended a few little changes and additions that were to make this home even more beautiful than it was for the lovely bride, who at last was really coming to gladden it with her presence. Pearle pleaded for a small, quiet wedding this time. "I dread a crowd," she said with a slight shiver, as she remembered the sea of curious horror-struck faces which had surrounded her on that day when she left the altar, believing herself the wretched wife of Addison Cheetham. So they let her have her way, and only the intimate friends of the two families were invited to witness the ceremony and the marriage feast. "What will you be married in, Pearle?" Alice asked one day, when such necessary questions as this were up for discussion. These two victims of a bad man's cupidity and passion had grown very dear to each other. Out of their mutual sorrow and trouble a beautiful friendship was ripening, and no topic was settled by either without the assenting voice of the other. Alice, or May as she preferred for some reason to be called now. "My name is Marie, and I like the sound of May," she said one day when Pearle had, playfully imitating Dr. Murdoch's tone, called her by that name, and so they had all gradually adopted it, was blooming into wonderful beauty. Every week added a more rounded outline to her cheek, and brought a brighter light to her eye, while ever and anon she might be heard trilling some sweet air to herself as her busy fingers helped to fashion the pretty things her friend was to wear when she gave herself to the man she loved. "What will you be married in, Pearle?" she had asked. The fair bride-elect grew sober at the question. There was much that was painful about these things, despite her joy. Her bridal this time must not, should not resemble in the least that former mockery. "I will be married in simple white tulle," she said gravely after a long and troubled silence, "and Alice, your own deft fingers shall weave my wreath of nothing more pretentious than white violets and maidenhair ferns." "It will be lovely," Alice said. Her whole heart was in this wedding, and she could not seem to do enough for the dear girl who had given a mother's care and love to her apparently orphaned child. And so, 3 months after her return to Ashton Manor, Pearle Ratcliffe went again to the church, and gave herself solemnly and reverently to the man whom she loved. The old rector's voice was tremulous and husky as he performed the ceremony, but a heartier blessing was never breathed upon a bride than that which he pronounced over Pearle when he made her the wife of Richard Burnholm. A lovelier bride everyone admitted they had never seen. There was nothing of the costly magnificence about Pearle's toilette on this occasion that there had been before, but she looked far more beautiful in every way. There was an indescribable charm about her that no one had ever seen before, a sweet and gentle dignity, a calm, deep joy in her glorious eyes, and a beautiful earnestness shining through her whole face that made her exceedingly attractive. To Richard Burnholm the day was a very solemn one. He could not in all his joy forget that other day when every hope had been so suddenly and ruthlessly crushed out of his life, and though he had no fears now that anything could rob him of his bride, yet unpleasant memories would force themselves upon him. He was deathly white until the words were spoken that bound Pearle to him for life, then the unnatural pallor passed, and as they paused for a moment in the vestry for the registry to be brought, he gathered his wife to his heart, and laying his lips to hers, murmured, "At last, my love, at last. God make our lives one long expression of gratitude for this joy." Pearle had no bridesmaids this time, but the fair maidens who had officiated in that capacity before were all present, even to the croaker Miss Charlotte Breton, who was Miss Breton still, and with no prospect of becoming anything else. Gentle Alice Arnaud was instantly attracted toward Alice Renaud, who looked very lovely in the finest and whitest of India muslins, garnished with charming little clusters of purple violets, and the two hovered continually about Pearle, their radiant faces testifying to the full sympathy they had with her joy. George Murdoch and his mother were present, as was also Sir Harold Cheswick. His gift to the bride was a magnificent diamond-studded necklace with a locket containing a life-likeness of Grace attached. Lady Fennelsey, too, and all her family were invited, but only her ladyship, with Franchita and the two younger children, responded by their presence to the invitation, although Camilla sent her kindest wishes, and joined her mother and sister in testifying their deep gratitude to Miss Radcliffe in an elegant decorated china tea service, delicate and costly enough for a prince. Pearle ignored everything unpleasant, and treated them in the kindest possible manner. And in after years, when Master Fred led to the altar the curly-haired, black-eyed niece of our heroine, a bond of perfect harmony was cemented between the two families. There was to be no tour. Pearle said she was weary of wandering, and longed for the rest and quiet of home. And so, after the sumptuous wedding breakfast had been dispatched, Richard Burnholm took his beautiful bride directly to Linden Grange. After their departure, George Murdoch suddenly missed a presence that had brightened the whole day for him, and possessed by a spirit of restlessness, he roamed from room to room seeking it. He could not find what he wished among the guests, and passing up the grand stairway, he found himself in a wide, handsome corridor, which was used partly as a picture gallery, and where a large collection of portraits and other paintings hung. He began to examine these, walking slowly down the hall. As he drew near an alcove at the end, he thought he saw the flutter of a white dress behind the crimson curtain which hung from the arch. Something instinctively told him who was there. In a moment more he had parted the drapery and stood in the presence of the woman he sought. She smiled as she said, "I have been watching the bride and groom on their way home, and wishing all manner of blessings upon them," and she pointed to the carriage slowly winding its way over the distant road. But the telltale blood in her cheeks, and the shy drooping of her lids, told him that she had been watching him also. "I have been looking for you, May," George Murdoch said gravely. He could not call her anything but May. It was the name that he had given her when she was nameless to him, and it was very dear to him. "For me? Can I do anything for you?" she asked demurely, while her eyes were fixed on that distant carriage. He reached down and took her hands. "Yes. You can fill my life with happiness," he said, in low, intense tones. "My darling, I have no words to tell you all that my heart contains for you, but my life shall live it if you will give yourself to me. Can you? Will you be my wife?" She looked up at him with grave sweetness, and said simply, "George, I owe my life to you." "Nay, dear," he interrupted with a glad smile, "I cannot take it as the payment of a debt." But he gathered her into his arms nevertheless as he spoke. "Then I will give it to you freely," she answered with a sigh of content as she nestled trustfully to him. "It is a blessed gift," he whispered, touching his lips to her forehead. Then drawing back and looking full into her eyes, he continued, "The world will say, May, that I am a fortune hunter, to seek you when I have nothing to offer you save my humble self and, perhaps, a growing reputation. Do you care?" "No, George, for I love you." And thus love laid low these most formidable of all barriers, wealth and position. "Richard, that Mr. Eugene Burnholm to whom you introduced me yesterday is very like you," Pearle said, the morning following her wedding, as they were sitting in their sunny dining-room and chatting over their cozy breakfast. "He is my cousin, Pearle." "And what do you think of his wife?" Richard asked, with a peculiar expression on his handsome face. "She is lovely. What beautiful hair and eyes she has. I was strangely attracted to her,
and I do not know how it is, but her voice sounded familiar to me," Pearle returned musingly.
"Everyone admires her. And Pearle, Eugene's wife, is Ariel." A vivid scarlet instantly flashed over the fair bride's face and neck, and tinkled even to her delicate fingertips at this unexpected intelligence. Richard arose from the table, and going around behind her chair, lifted her face gently, and bending down kissed her tenderly on the lips. "I did not mean to startle you so, dear," he said regretfully. "But come with me to the library, and I will now tell you all Ariel's sad story, and why and how it was that I seemed to be guilty of double-dealing."
"No, Richard, there is no need. I have long been ashamed of my suspicions,"
Pearle began brokenly. "Darling, it is right that you should know all about it now. It is a secret no longer. Then it was, and I was bound by my word and honor to keep it." He drew her hand within his arm, and led her to the library. Wheeling a low chair into the bay window, he placed her in it, and then seating himself upon a hassock at her feet, he began. "5 years ago, my cousin Eugene, a kind-hearted but wild and impulsive fellow, first met Ariel Arkwright, the beautiful daughter of a retired clergyman. He fell desperately in love with her at once, and she returned his affection. Their courtship was ardent and short, and though Ariel's father strongly opposed the match, they were wilful, and were married in less than 6 months from the time of their first meeting. Ariel's father died shortly afterward. He had long been feeble. She had no mother, no near relatives, and was thus left entirely dependent upon her somewhat unstable husband. Eugene had no income beyond what his father supplied him. He never applied himself closely to study and had no profession, and it was a very unwise thing for him to marry. When my uncle discovered what he had done, he was so enraged at his folly and his disrespect toward him in not consulting him upon so important a question, that he stopped his income and sent him adrift without a penny. In his trouble Eugene came to me, asking my advice and assistance, and I promised to aid him if he would agree to forsake all his wild ways, and be faithful to the beautiful wife he had won. He pledged himself, and I believed him to be sincere. But it was hard work to find a situation such as he was fitted for, and several months passed before any opportunity to earn his living presented itself. At last I learned that a friend was going abroad and desired a clerk. I applied for and succeeded in obtaining the situation. But the salary was small, though my friend promised to increase it if Eugene proved himself efficient. It was a great trial that he would have to be separated from his wife for a while, but he could not take her, and I told him that I would assume the care of her while he was away. I hired that little cottage which is called the Dovecote, furnished it for Ariel, and supplied her with a servant. There her little one was born in less than 3 months after her husband went away. In the meantime I discovered that he had been guilty of many indiscretions. There were debts of honor to be paid, and many other bills were presented of which he, I suppose, had been ashamed to tell me. I felt that money was no object if I could do anything to encourage and help make a man of him, and I paid everyone, but kept a strict account of everything, and of the household expenses at the Dovecote in that little book which you saw. The poor child, his wife, so alone and so young, clung to me as if I had been her brother. And indeed she was so sweet and lovable that I was not long in learning to regard her as a dear sister. I went often to see her, and gave her every comfort which I could crowd into the little house. But I had to do all this secretly, for Eugene had made me promise that no one should know where his wife was until he could return and give her a suitable home of her own. He proved himself a valuable and trustworthy clerk. My friend became deeply interested in him, and through his influence Eugene has now obtained a situation in London that renders him independent, and he is as happy as a man need to be with his lovely wife and beautiful boy, whom they both insisted in calling Richard, out of gratitude to me." "How simple it all seems now that I understand it," Pearle said with a sigh. "Where did your cousin first meet his wife?" she asked after a moment. "In France, during one of his wild races over the country. They were living there for a time on account of her father's health, and she and Eugene were married in the very same church where Alice Renault was wedded." Ariel in some way lost or destroyed her marriage certificate, and when she found that her husband was returning to England, she wrote, insisting that he should go to Bar-le-Duc on his way home, and bring her a copy of their marriage record. And so it happened that we met him there, and in that way discovered the record of that other marriage." "How strange it all seems," said Pearle meditatively. Then putting her white hands upon her husband's shoulders, and bending so that she could look into his face, she continued, "I am proud of my noble husband. Dear Richard, forgive me for my unreasonable suspicions of you." "Hush," he interrupted, laying his fingers playfully upon her lips. "I do not wonder that you suspected me. A less suspicious person would have believed even worse than you did under the same circumstances. How you must have suffered, my darling, that night when you followed me to the Dovecote. But let us not dwell upon those days. Let us forget the past and the bright present, and what it promises for the future. If we have lost a year, we will try to make the most of those to come." "The year has not been lost," Pearle returned with grave sweetness. "I believe I am far better fitted to be your wife now than I was before our trouble overtook us. If my happiness had been secured then, if everything had been just as we wished, I fear I should have lived selfishly and thoughtlessly all my life. Now I have seen and realized something of the sorrow there is in the world, and the need there is that everyone should contribute out of his or her life to brighten that of others. My lesson in adversity has taught me that God, not self, should be first in our hearts, and that to do good and deal kindly with those around us are duties which we owe to Him." 6 months after the wedding at Ashton Manor, there was another at Sir Harold Cheswick's residence in Hyde Park Corner, London, where he gave his adopted daughter into the care of George Murdoch. Years have passed since then, and Alice Renault reigns in her elegant home a loved and honored wife. Her husband has attained fame and reputation as a skillful physician, and is now employed in families where once he would not have dreamed of being allowed to enter. His mother, a sweet-faced, silver-haired old lady, vibrates between the nursery and the schoolroom, and is never more content than, when the day is over, she gathers their inmates, a George, a Margaret, pet-named Pearle, and a little Harold, together with the more sedate Amy, around her, to relate some wonderful story of that mystic long ago, when she was young. Sir Harold, too, has his bright corner in this pleasant home, and often declares the best investment he ever made was when he adopted this charming daughter upon that eventful day at Vannes. In Richard Burnholm's home there is an Alice and an Allstone, but the chief charm of that circle is in the gracious matron whose sweet and self-denying life, whose devotion not only to her own family, but to the interests of all around her, has drawn all hearts to her with a love and reverence that will long outlast the years of her life, and then rise up to call her blessed. The End of Lost, a Pearle, by Georgie Sheldon. Recorded by Céline Major. Thank you for listening.